Tonight, before anything else, picture a small clay lamp burning in a storeroom on an island in the middle of a warm sea. It is a shallow lamp, no bigger than the palm of a hand, and it holds a little olive oil and a twist of flax for a wick, and it makes a soft orange circle about the width of a supper table. Around that circle stand jars. They are enormous jars, taller than the man who tends the lamp, with rope patterns pressed into their shoulders and handles like folded arms, and they are full of oil, and grain and dried beans and figs pressed into cakes. The corridor runs on beyond the lamplight, and there are more jars in the dark, hundreds of them, in room after room after room, and above the storerooms there are staircases, and painted walls, and light wells that drop the daylight down through 3 floors, and beyond the walls there is a town, and beyond the town there are hills of olive trees, and beyond the hills there is the sea. The man with the lamp is a clerk. He is not a king. He is counting oil, and on a small tablet of damp clay he is scratching marks that no living person today can read. Hold that little lamp in your mind. We will come back to it, and to the day it went out a good while from now. Tonight we are going to travel from that lamp all the way to a young king lying ill in a hot brick palace 2,000 miles east of it, with the whole world he had walked through waiting outside the door. Between those 2 rooms lie about 2,000 years. And everything in between is the story of the Greeks. So settle now. Settle into whatever stillness you have made for yourself tonight. Let the lamp beside you grow dim, or let it go out altogether. Let the pillow take the weight of your head, and then let your shoulders come down, 1 quiet inch at a time, the way they only ever do when nobody is asking anything of you. There is nothing to follow here. There is nothing to remember. If you drift away in the first 10 minutes, you have used this properly, and the rest will go on quietly without you, the way a river goes on past a sleeping town. If you enjoy what I make here, and only if you truly do, you might leave a like or subscribe, so that more people who cannot sleep tonight can find their way to a quiet voice. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments. It helps. There is something steadying about scrolling through a list of small hours from all over the world and understanding that you are not the only one awake. Here is the shape of the whole night, so that you never have to hold on to anything. We will begin before there were Greeks at all, with the rock and the rain and the sea that made them, and the first farmers who walked in with seed in their bags. We will build the painted palaces of Crete and the great stone citadels on the mainland. And then we will watch the entire Bronze Age world come apart in about 50 years, and the writing be forgotten, and the palaces stand empty in the grass for 400 years. Then we will watch the recovery, which was slow and stubborn, and began with an alphabet borrowed from traders and improved almost by accident. We will watch a strange new kind of town appear, the city that governed itself, and we will watch about 1,000 of them scatter around the Mediterranean like seeds. We will sit with the Spartans and with the Athenians, who were nothing alike. We will watch a small collection of quarrelsome towns turn back the largest empire on earth, and then spend their winnings on marble and tragedy and philosophy, and then spend a great deal more of it on a long and pointless war with each other. We will meet a one-eyed king from the north with a new kind of spear, and his son, who took an army east until the army politely refused to go any further. And then we will watch the Greek world spread from Egypt to the edge of India, and slowly fold into Rome and go on being read anyway quietly for 2,000 years more. That is the whole of it, from the clay lamp in the storeroom to the young king in Babylon and out the other side. Now let us go back one layer further to before there was anything you could call Greece, because the land came first, and the land wrote a great deal of what happened afterwards. Imagine the southern edge of Europe crumbling into the sea. That is more or less what it is. It is not a country in the way that a broad plain is a country. It is a rumpled and broken place, all limestone ridges and narrow valleys where the mountains come down almost to the shoreline, and the shoreline comes back at them in hundreds of bays and inlets and long crooked fingers of water. Nowhere in the whole of it is more than about 60 miles from the sea. Roughly 4/5 of the land is too steep or too stony to plow. What is left is a scatter of small pockets of good earth, each one tucked behind its own ring of hills, each one just about big enough to feed a few thousand people if the rain came, and each one separated from the next by a walk of several hours up and over. And then the islands. Somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 of them, depending on how small a rock you are willing to count. Laid out across the sea like stepping stones so that a boat leaving the mainland could hop from one to the next and be in sight of land almost the whole way to Asia. That single fact shaped everything. The mountains kept the Greeks apart and made them stubborn and local and endlessly convinced that the next valley over was full of fools. The sea brought them back together and made them traders and travelers and gossips. They were divided by the land and united by the water, and they never entirely stopped being both. The weather was and is dry and bright and hard on anything fussy. Rain comes in the winter and then stops for months. The summer sun bakes the thin red soil to something like fired pottery. What grows there is what can wait. Barley, which asks for very little. The grapevine, which will drive its roots down through cracked rock and find water that nothing else can reach. And above all, the olive, which is a slow, patient, obstinate tree that can live for 600 years, will grow on a slope no plow can touch, and will produce almost nothing at all for the first 15 years of its life. Planting an olive tree is a promise made to your grandchildren. A people who lived on olives were a people who thought in long stretches of time, whether they meant to or not. The first farmers came in around 9,000 years ago, drifting across from the lands to the east with wheat and barley and sheep and goats in their care, and they settled in the northern plains where the soil was deepest and the rivers were kindest. For thousands of years after that, nothing that anyone would call history happened at all, which is rather the point of those thousands of years. Small villages of mud brick and thatch grew and shrank on the same low mounds until the mounds themselves were made of old villages. People made pots and buried their dead under the floor so as to keep them nearby, and figured out that a goat will eat absolutely anything which is useful, and that a goat will therefore also eat the seedlings of the forest, which turned out over several thousand years to be a rather serious problem. Slowly the hillsides went bare. Slowly the thin soil washed down into the valleys and out to sea. The Greeks would eventually write about their own land as a body worn down to the bones, all the soft flesh of it carried away, and they were not wrong. But before any of that mattered, something small and remarkable happened out on the water. On the little island of Melos, in the middle of the southern sea, there are outcrops of obsidian, which is black volcanic glass that breaks into blades sharper than anything else available before metal. Obsidian from Melos has been found in a cave on the mainland in layers more than 11,000 years old. which means that before farming, before pottery, before villages of any size, somebody was already crossing 60 miles of open water and coming back again with a boat full of black glass. They had no sails yet. They were paddling. The sea was never a wall to these people. It was the road, and it was the road first. Around 5,000 years ago, metal arrived, and everything sped up a little. Copper on its own is soft and disappointing. Copper mixed with about 1 part in 10 of tin becomes bronze, which holds an edge and casts beautifully and rings when you strike it. The difficulty is that copper and tin almost never occur in the same place. Copper came from Cyprus, whose name and the word for the metal are tangled together to this day. Tin came from very far away indeed, from the mountains of Central Asia and possibly from the far western edge of Europe, moving hand to hand along routes so long that nobody who handled the metal at either end had any real idea what lay in the middle. Bronze, in other words, could only exist inside a network. The Bronze Age was not a technology. It was a web of ships and donkeys and agreements and gifts stretching from Britain to Afghanistan, and every bronze pin in every village was proof that the web was still holding. Remember that, because in a while the web is going to snap. The first people in the Aegean to grow rich on that web lived on the small, dry islands of the Cyclades, that ring of sunburnt rocks scattered in the southern sea. They mined the obsidian and quarried astonishingly white marble and worked lead and silver. And they carved figurines that looked startlingly modern, slender, standing women with folded arms, the nose the only feature raised on a flat oval face, the whole thing smoothed down to a shape you want to hold in your hand. Thousands of years later, painters and sculptors would look at them and feel that someone had reached forward through time and handed them something. What the islanders themselves meant by them, nobody knows. They were laid in graves, mostly lying down, mostly broken first, and traces of paint show that the blank faces once had eyes and mouths and even patterns on the cheeks. They are quiet objects, and they have kept their quiet. Then came Crete, and with Crete the Aegean got its first real civilization. Crete is a long mountain wall of an island lying across the southern entrance to the Aegean like a doorman, close enough to Egypt for a ship to make the crossing in a few days with a following wind, close enough to the Levant to hear its news, and just far enough from everyone to be safe. Somewhere around 4,000 years ago, the Cretans began to build. Not fortresses, palaces. At Knossos, at Phaistos, at Malea and Zakros, and half a dozen smaller places, they laid out huge rambling complexes of hundreds of rooms around a large rectangular open courtyard. And then they kept adding to them for 600 years until the plan of the biggest of them stopped making sense to anybody arriving for the first time. The word labyrinth may well come from these buildings, and if you have ever tried to find your way back out of a very large old building, you will understand exactly how the story started. What is remarkable about the Cretan palaces is what they lack. They have almost no defensive walls, in an age when everyone else was piling up stone against their neighbors. These enormous rich buildings sat open to the countryside, which suggests either an unusually peaceful island or a very great deal of confidence in the fleet. They had drains. They had proper drains, with terracotta pipes tapered so that the water ran faster and flushed the line clean, and light wells cut down through several floors so that daylight and cool air reached rooms buried in the middle of the block and stairs that turned around themselves. The upper floors held workshops and living rooms, and the walls were painted. That is the thing everyone remembers. The Cretan painters worked in wet plaster with a palette of ochre and charcoal and a beautiful Egyptian blue. And what they chose to paint was not conquest and not slaughter. They painted dolphins. They painted blue monkeys and partridges, lilies and crocuses and reeds, women in flounced skirts with their hair in ringlets talking with their hands, young men carrying tall cups in a procession, and again the extraordinary business with the bull, where an athlete grasps the horns of a charging animal and vaults clean over its back to land on the far side. Whether anyone actually did that or whether it was the sort of thing everyone agreed used to happen in the old days is still argued about. Underneath the paintings, the palaces did their real work, which was accounting. The storerooms at Knossos alone could hold something like 250,000 liters of oil and grain. The palace gathered the countryside surplus, kept it, and gave it out again, and to keep track of that they wrote. First in a picture script, then in a flowing script that we call Linear A, on small clay tablets that were never meant to last more than a season. They survive only because the buildings that held them burned and fire bakes clay into pottery. Nobody can read Linear A. We know what many of the little pictures beside the numbers must mean, so we can see that a tablet is recording so many sheep or so much oil. But the language behind the signs is not Greek and is not related to anything anyone has identified, and so the Cretans of the Palace Age remain the only literate people of the Bronze Age Mediterranean whose own voice we do not have. We have their shopping lists and cannot read a word. Then, one morning about 3,500 years ago, the island of Thera exploded. Thera lies 70 miles north of Crete, and it was a proper island once, with a town on it. The eruption was one of the largest in human history. It threw somewhere between 15 and 40 cubic miles of rock into the sky, emptied the magma chamber, and dropped the whole center of the island into the sea, leaving the ring of cliffs that ships sail into today. A drowned crater 400 feet deep with the layers of the old island written on its walls like a cut cake. The town on Thera is called Akrotiri, and it is the reason we know as much as we do, because the ash sealed it. There are 2-story and 3-story houses there with their staircases intact, and beds, and looms, and lavatories, and walls painted with an entire fleet of ships sailing between 2 towns while dolphins run alongside, and a boy carrying fish on a string, and a room where painted lilies grow up the plaster, and swallows court each other in the air above them. And there are no bodies. Not one has been found. The people of Akrotiri felt the earthquakes that came first, understood what they meant, packed what they could carry, and left. The ash fell on empty rooms. On Crete, 70 miles downwind, the ash fell too, and the sea came in over the harbors, and the whole southern Aegean must have gone dark in the middle of the day. For a long time it was assumed that the eruption simply destroyed the Cretan world. The dates do not quite allow that. Crete carried on for another 100 years or more after Thera, but it carried on limping. Ships had been lost, harbors ruined, farmland poisoned by salt and ash, and in that weakened century the palaces of Crete burned one after another, and when Knossos was rebuilt and reoccupied, the clerks in the storerooms were writing in a different script. It has the same signs, more or less, but it is being used for another language. When it was finally deciphered 3,500 years later by a young English architect working on it as a hobby in the evenings, the language turned out to be Greek. Early, awkward, unmistakable Greek. Somebody else was counting the oil now. The people who had come across from the mainland had not brought their own bookkeeping system. They had simply taken over the building and the clerks and the jars. Those mainlanders are the Mycenaeans, and they are the first people in this story who were certainly, provably, Greek. They had been there a long time already, farming the plains of the south, unremarkable and poor. And then somewhere around 3,600 years ago, a handful of families at a place called Mycenae became very rich very quickly, and nobody is entirely certain how. The evidence is in their graves. There are 2 circles of deep shaft graves at Mycenae, cut down into the rock and roofed over, and what came out of them changed how everyone thought about early Greece. Masks of beaten gold laid over the faces of the dead, gold cups, gold diadems, hundreds of thin gold discs sewn onto clothing that has long since rotted away, daggers inlaid with running lions in silver and dark bronze, amber that had come all the way from the northern sea, ostrich eggs from Africa. It was so much gold that the man who dug it up in the 1870s was convinced he had found the kings of legend themselves, and sent a telegram saying he had gazed upon the face of a very famous king. He had not. The graves were 300 years too early. But he was right about the important thing, which was that the old stories had a real world behind them. Where the wealth came from is still debated. Probably from selling the one thing these people had in quantity, which was fighting men, hired out to the rich kingdoms across the water. Probably from trade, and from the sort of trade that in those days shaded gently into piracy, depending on the size of the other ship. However it came, within a few generations the Mycenaeans had gone from mud villages to something new, and they built like people who did not expect to be liked. Their citadels crown steep hills, and their walls are made of limestone blocks so large that later Greeks, looking up at them, decided flatly that no human beings could have lifted them and that giants must have done the work. The gate at Mycenae still stands, with 2 great lionesses carved above the lintel, facing each other across a column, their heads once made separately in some finer material and long since gone. Under those walls, the people lived in the open. Inside them, on the summit, was the palace, and the heart of the palace was a single big rectangular hall with 4 columns around a round central hearth and a throne against the wall. That hall is the ancestor of every Greek temple that came afterwards, and because these palaces also burned, we can read their books. The clay tablets of Mycenaean Greek, the script called Linear B, are the oldest Greek writing in existence, older than the alphabet by 600 years, and reading them is one of the stranger experiences in all of history, because they are unbelievably boring. There is no poetry. There is no chronicle. There is not one royal boast. There is so many pairs of wheels unfit for use, so many women working at flax with so many girls and so many boys, and their monthly ration of wheat and figs, so much bronze issued to a named smith, so many oxen, one of them named Dapple, one of them named Blackfoot, rowers to go to a certain port, 30 of them, a missing quantity of oil that somebody had better account for. It is the paperwork of a very controlling government, and from it a whole society can be reconstructed. At the top sat a figure whose title was the Wanax, which is a word for a lord that would later drop out of ordinary Greek and survive only in poetry, as if the word itself had become too grand for the world that came after. Below him, a war leader, then the holders of estates, then the people of the village with their shared land, then the workers with their rations, and, at the bottom, slaves. Many of them women taken from across the sea, listed by their place of origin. The palace organized everything. It gave out the wool by weight and expected the cloth back by weight. It fixed the number of chariot wheels. It employed bronze smiths, perfume makers who boiled sage and rose into oil, chariot builders, bakers, bath attendants, and it wrote every one of them down. And it engineered. The Mycenaeans built roads with culverts and bridges for their chariots, and some of those bridges are still standing, 3,500 years later, carrying nothing. They built a dam to divert a river away from a town. In one valley, they drained an entire lake, cutting channels and tunnels through the rock to take the water away, and turned the lake bed into farmland. And when the palaces fell and nobody maintained the tunnels, the lake came back and stayed for 3,000 years until engineers with steam pumps drained it again in the 19th century. Their tombs were as ambitious as their walls. The great beehive tombs are enormous domes of corbelled stone, each ring of blocks stepped a little further inward than the one below until the circle closes at the top, then buried under a mound with a long-walled passage leading in. The largest of them has a lintel block over the doorway weighing something like 120 tons. Nobody has satisfactorily explained how it was lifted. That dome was the widest and tallest unsupported span anywhere in the world for the next 1,400 years, until the Romans built their great domed temple in the middle of their city. Every one of those tombs was robbed in antiquity, which is what happens when you build a spectacular door and then leave it where everyone can see it. And they went to Troy. Or at least they went to the northeastern corner of the Aegean, where a fortified city sat on a low hill commanding the entrance to the straits that lead up to the Black Sea, in a position to tax or delay everything that passed. The city was rebuilt on the same spot at least 9 times, and one of those cities was burnt at about the right period. And Mycenaean pottery is scattered all over the site. Whether the War of the Songs happened and whether a fleet of 1,000 ships ever came for one woman is not a question archaeology can answer. What archaeology can say is that there was a rich city exactly where the songs put it, that it fell in the general age they put it in, and that the people who told the songs had once lived in the palaces and remembered them. Which is enough, because the songs are what came through the fire. For about 300 years the Mycenaean world worked. Its pots turn up in Egypt and Sicily and along the coast of Syria. A wrecked merchant ship of that age, found off the Turkish coast, was carrying 10 tons of copper and oxide-shaped ingots, a ton of tin, glass ingots the color of deep water, ebony, ivory, resin, olives, a gold scarab bearing the name of an Egyptian queen, and a set of merchants' weights. And it had aboard the goods of at least 7 different cultures at once. That single ruined hull is the whole Bronze Age world in one hold. Around 3,200 years ago, that world stopped. It is worth slowing down here, because what happened next is one of the strangest events in the human record, and it is the reason the story has to start twice. In the space of about 50 years, nearly every palace, capital, and great city in the eastern Mediterranean was destroyed or abandoned. Not one kingdom, not one region, all of them, more or less together. The great empire that ruled the middle of Anatolia from a mountain capital of stone lions and gate towers simply stopped existing. And its capital was emptied so thoroughly that the archaeologists who dug it found the storerooms cleaned out and the sacred objects removed, as if the last people there had packed properly before leaving. The rich port city on the Syrian coast, which had a palace with a library and scribes writing in 7 or 8 languages, burned and was never reoccupied. And in the ashes of the last day were found letters that had been written but not yet sent. Cyprus burned. The cities of the Levantine coast burned. Egypt survived, but only just, and only by fighting 2 great wars against invaders coming by land and by sea, and it never again ruled beyond its own borders as it had. And in Greece, one after another, every single palace burned. Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, the rebuilt palace at Knossos. The tablets at the palace on the western coast record, in their last weeks, watchers being posted along the shore, and rowers being sent out, and unusual offerings being made to the gods, including some that looked like an attempt to buy help at any price. Then the fire, which baked those tablets and preserved them. Which is a bitter kind of luck. Nobody knows what did it. The honest answer is that it was probably everything at once. There is good evidence now for a long drought from pollen cores and cave formations and lake beds all around the region, running for perhaps a century and a half, in a world where the great cities depended on imported grain. There were earthquakes. In a period geologists suspect saw a whole sequence of them along the same fault system. There were migrations of hungry people. There were the raiders the Egyptians recorded and drew on their temple walls, coming in ships with bird-headed prows and in ox carts with their families and their household goods aboard, which is not a raiding party, but a nation on the move. And underneath all of it, there was the fragility of the web itself. The whole system had grown so interconnected that a failure anywhere traveled everywhere. If the tin stops coming, the smiths stop working. If the smiths stop, the soldiers cannot be re-equipped. If the grain ships stop, the palace cannot pay the rowers who protect the grain ships. Each kingdom was a machine for redistributing goods, and machines for redistributing goods do not survive very long once there is nothing to redistribute. The people who ran them were unusually good at accounting and unusually bad at flexibility. So the palaces went, and with them went a great deal more than buildings. Writing was forgotten. Not lost in a fire, not banned, simply not needed. Because Linear B existed only to serve palace accounting, and once the palace was gone, the script had no purpose, and no ordinary person had ever learned it. Within 2 generations, nobody in Greece could read. Monumental buildings stopped for 400 years. Fresco painting stopped. Ivory carving, gem cutting, the making of fine glass, the long-distance trade in tin, the roads, the drainage schemes, all of it stopped. Population fell steeply, perhaps by 2/3 or more in some regions, and the villages that were left were tiny and scattered and moved up onto defensible hills, and the pottery got simpler, and then simpler again. This is what used to be called the Dark Age, a term historians now use with more caution, partly because it was not uniformly dark, and partly because the phrase makes it sound like a moral judgment on people who were doing their best. But something did go out. For 4 centuries, the Greeks lived in small places and buried their dead simply, and forgot the names of the kings who had built the great walls above them. And yet 3 things survived those 400 years, and everything afterwards grew from them. The first was the language. Greek did not die. It splintered into dialects, and the splinters would later become the badge of who was who, but the language went on being spoken every single day. And it went on carrying words from the Palace Age like fossils in stone. The second was iron. The collapse ended the tin trade, and bronze became scarce, and so people were driven to a metal that is common everywhere and difficult to work, iron ore, which needs a much hotter fire and a great deal more skill, and which yields a tool that anyone can own. Bronze had been the metal of palaces. Iron was the metal of farmers. A world that had been forced onto iron was a world where a village could make its own plowshares without asking permission from anybody, and that quietly changed who could matter. The third was memory carried in song. Because there was no writing and the winter evenings were long, singers went on singing about the age of the great walls. And they did it in a formal poetic language kept alive by generations of memory, with fixed phrases that could be slotted in as the line required, so that a singer could compose in performance without ever writing anything down. The rosy-fingered dawn, the wine-dark sea, the swift-footed runner. Those tags are the tools that made memory possible. And so, all through the dark centuries, in villages with no stone buildings and no records and no bronze to spare, people sat by the fire listening to detailed and confident descriptions of golden cups and boar's tusk helmets and palaces with bathing rooms and gates the giants had built. They were listening to the true inventory of a world that had ended before their great-great-grandparents were born, preserved almost perfectly by people who had no idea they were preserving anything. There is one grave from the middle of those quiet centuries that keeps the whole picture from being too gloomy. On the island of Euboea, at a place called Lefkendi. Under a huge building more than 150 feet long with a curved end and a wooden colonnade all around it, archaeologists found 2 burials, a woman laid out with gold discs over her breasts and a gold and iron pin, and beside her, in a bronze vessel that had been made in Cyprus generations earlier and kept as an heirloom, the ashes of a man with his weapons. And in a shaft next to them, 4 horses, buried with their bits still in place. That is a chieftain's funeral in the poorest age of Greece, with imported treasure and horses and a hall built to be part of the ceremony. Whoever they were not living in a wasteland. They were living in a smaller world with the memory of a bigger one, and they were doing well enough in it to be buried like the people in the songs. The recovery, when it came fast. Somewhere around 2,800 years ago, the graveyards begin to fill again, the settlements grow, iron tools spread, and within a century or so, the population of some regions had multiplied several times over. And into that rising world came the single most useful object anyone in this story ever borrowed. The Phoenicians, the traders of the Levantine coast, had a writing system of about 22 signs, one for each consonant, no pictures, no hundreds of syllable signs, no scribal school required. It was designed by merchants for merchants, and it could be learned by an ordinary adult in a few weeks. Greeks meeting them in ports somewhere in the east took the whole set, kept the order, kept the names of the letters even though the names meant nothing at all in Greek, and then made one change that mattered more than the borrowing itself. Phoenician had several sounds Greek did not use. Rather than throw the spare letters away, the Greeks assigned them to vowels. And with that, for the first time anywhere, a script existed that could write down the exact sound of a sentence, including the sounds of a language it had never been designed for, including a song, including a joke, including a name nobody had heard before. Every alphabet in Europe descends from it, and so does the one these words were first typed in. Some of the very earliest Greek writing that survives is not a law or a prayer. It is a line scratched around the belly of a wine jug, offering the jug as a prize to whichever dancer is performing most gracefully. That is what they did with it first. They wrote a party game. Then, within a couple of generations, somebody used it to write down the songs. Whether one man made the two great poems, or whether they were the summit of a long tradition finally fixed in writing, has been argued about for 2,500 years without resolution. What is certain is that around this period, the long poem about the anger of one warrior during a siege, and the long poem about the 10-year journey home of another took the shape we still have. They are enormous. One runs to more than 15,000 lines, and they are strange because they are set 400 years before they were written in the vanished palace world, and they know things about that world that the poet cannot possibly have seen. Helmets made of rows of boar's tusks, which nobody had made for centuries and which turned up in excavations only in the 20th century, exactly as described. What the poems gave the Greeks was not history. It was a common inheritance. From the Black Sea to Spain, wherever Greeks went, everybody knew the same stories and could quote them and name their sons after the same heroes, and could stand in a strange port and discover that a total stranger had the same furniture in his head. In a world of 1,000 separate towns, that shared furniture was the nearest thing to a nation. And at almost the same time, a farmer in a Stony Hill village wrote a very different poem, the first in Europe with an ordinary man's own voice in it. He complained about the weather and about his brother and about corrupt local nobles who leaned on the judgments, and he laid out the working year, when to plow, when to prune, when to sail, and when it is madness to sail, when to rest in the shade with a cake and some wine and the wind off the mountain. He also said that his father had come across the sea because he was poor, and that he himself had once traveled to a poetry contest, won a tripod, and dedicated it, which is the earliest boast in Greek literature and a very small and human one. Between the two poets, the heroes and the farmer, the Greeks had their two halves. Meanwhile, out of the rising villages, an odd new thing was taking shape, and this is the invention that makes all the rest possible. Call it the city that governs itself. In most of the world at that date, if you had a city, you had a palace in it, and a king, and a temple bureaucracy, and everything that happened because somebody at the top instructed it. What emerged in Greece was a town of a few thousand people with the farmland around it that considered itself an independent country, and in which the decisions were made by an assembly of its own adult male citizens standing in the open air and voting. Not everywhere at once, and not smoothly, and never with anything like the fairness we would ask for now, since women had no vote. Foreigners could not be citizens no matter how long they lived there, and slavery was everywhere and unquestioned. But the principle was radical even so, that the community was not the property of a ruler, that the laws belonged to everybody, and that authority was something that could be handed to a man for a year and then taken back off him. About 1,000 of these little states existed. Most were tiny. The average one had a territory of about 30 square miles and a few thousand inhabitants, and could be walked across in an afternoon. Each had its own calendar, its own coins, its own weights and measures, its own festivals, its own version of the gods, and its own passionate certainty that it was the important one. Each had a marketplace, which was also the meeting ground and the courtroom and the gossip exchange, and a high point with the temples on it, and if it could afford them, walls. And each of them defended itself, not with a professional army, but with its own farmers. The way they fought is the other half of the invention. Somewhere in this period, the Greeks worked out a formation in which heavily armored infantry stood shoulder to shoulder in ranks 8 deep, each man carrying a round shield about 3 feet across. Gripped by a band at the forearm and a handle at the rim so that half of it stuck out to the left and covered the unarmored side of the man beside him. That is the crucial detail, and it is worth pausing on, because a whole political system grows out of it. Every man in that line was protected by his neighbor's shield. If one man ran, he opened his neighbor. The formation only worked if it held, and it only held if the men in it trusted one another and had something in common worth standing for. Nobody bought them. They bought their own armor, which cost about as much as a good pair of oxen, and they came out when the crops allowed, and they went home again afterwards. A city defended by farmers who paid for their own equipment could not be governed for very long by somebody those farmers despised. The line in the field and the assembly in the marketplace were the same men, and they knew it. That is the machine. A small self-governing town, a shared body of poetry, an alphabet anyone could learn, an army of smallholders, and a great deal more mouths than the stony land could feed, which brings us to the part where they filled the entire Mediterranean. The problem was simple arithmetic. Greek families were growing, and Greek farmland was not. A man with 3 sons and 11 acres of hillside had a decision to make, and it was not a comfortable one. Because Greek inheritance generally divided the land between the sons, and land divided too many times will not feed anybody. So for about 250 years, beginning around 2,750 years ago, the Greek cities did something extraordinary, and did it in an orderly, almost bureaucratic way. They exported their surplus people. This was not a wandering. It was organized. A city that had decided to send out a colony would consult the oracle first, because nobody in their right mind founded a settlement without asking. It would appoint a founder, a respected man who would lead the expedition, choose the site, lay out the streets and the sacred ground, and divide the farmland into equal lots to be drawn by chance so that nobody could complain about favoritism. Sometimes families drew lots for who had to go. Sometimes younger sons volunteered. In at least one recorded case, the mother city stated in writing that anyone who sailed back within a set number of years would forfeit everything, which tells you the mood on the beach that morning. Then a few hundred people got into ships with seed grain and tools and fire carried from their home hearth, and sailed off to a coastline they knew only by rumor. And they went everywhere. Along the toe and heel of Italy and all around Sicily, so thickly that the Romans later called the whole region Great Greece. To the site that became Naples, whose name simply means new city and has now been new for 2,700 years. Up the northern Aegean, and then through the straits past the site that would one day be Constantinople, and then Istanbul, and out into the Black Sea, which they cautiously named the Hospitable Sea in the hope that saying so would help, and around its whole shore into the grasslands of the Scythian horsemen who traded them grain and dried fish and slaves. West to the coast of what is now France, where a colony founded around 600 years before Christ became Marseille, and brought the vine and the olive to Gaul, which is a debt French civilization has been quietly paying off ever since. On to the coast of Spain, south to Libya, where a colony grew rich, exporting a medicinal plant so profitable and so thoroughly harvested that it went extinct, which may be the earliest recorded case of an economy consuming its only product. And in Egypt, by arrangement with the pharaoh, a trading town where Greeks could live and do business and, incidentally, look at monuments that were already older to them than the fall of Rome is to us, standing at the foot of a pyramid that had been built 2,000 years before you were born, will change how a young man thinks about time. Egypt gave the Greeks the taste for monumental stone building and the standing male statue with 1 foot forward, and a set of measurements, and a permanent inferiority complex about the age of their own culture that they never entirely shook off. Trade followed the settlements, and with trade came 2 more inventions. The first was money. Around this period, in the kingdom of Lydia in Western Asia, somebody began stamping lumps of a natural gold and silver alloy with a mark to guarantee the weight, and the Greek cities of the coast picked the idea up almost at once and improved it, striking silver coins with the badge of their city on them, an owl, a turtle, a bunch of grapes, a winged horse, the seal of the town made portable. Before coinage, wealth was land and cattle and metal by weight. After coinage, wealth was countable, hoardable, lendable, and anonymous, and a man of no family at all could accumulate it. Which brings us to the second thing, which is trouble. The old aristocracies were built on land and birth. Suddenly there were men with warehouses full of oil and no ancestors worth mentioning. And there were smallholders drowning in debt because a bad harvest in a thin-soiled country is not survivable without borrowing, and the debts were often secured on the borrower himself, so that a run of poor years could end with a free farmer working land he no longer owned, or worse, sold overseas. In city after city, the pressure built until somebody used it. The Greek word for the men who did is tyrant, and it did not originally mean a monster. It meant a ruler who had taken power outside the rules, usually by promising the ordinary people the things the noble families had refused them. Some were brutal. A striking number were extremely competent. They canceled debts, redistributed land, hired the unemployed to build harbors and temples and water tunnels, sponsored poets, founded festivals, and made their cities visibly grander, all of which was excellent politics. On the island of Samos, a tyrant had an aqueduct driven straight through a mountain, 2 teams digging from opposite sides more than 3,000 feet of tunnel. And it met in the middle with an error of only a few feet, which for surveying with rope and sight lines is close to a miracle. The tyrants did the Greeks one very large accidental favor. By breaking the grip of the old noble families, they cleared the ground, and when the tyrants themselves were eventually thrown out, as almost all of them were within 2 or 3 generations, what stepped into the space was not the aristocracy coming back. It was the assembly. So, by about 2,500 years ago, the picture is this: a ring of Greek-speaking cities all around the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, from Spain to the Caucasus, which one philosopher described as sitting around the water like frogs around a pond. A common language in several dialects, a common set of stories, common festivals where the whole scattered nation met, coined silver, alphabetic writing, a merchant fleet, and a fierce local independence that made the whole thing impossible to unite, and impossible to conquer piece by piece without a great deal of patience. 2 of those cities were about to become far more important than the rest, and they had almost nothing in common. One lay in a wide, fertile valley in the south, ringed by mountains, with no walls at all, because it had decided that its walls would be its men. The other lay on a dry plain by the sea in the east, with a great rock in the middle of it and silver in the hills to the south. We should go and look at both of them properly, and we will start with the strange one. Sparta sat in the valley of a fast, cold river in the south of the peninsula, with a high range of mountains rising to the west, snow on them into the early summer, and some of the best farmland in Greece spread out around it. A traveler expecting a capital would have been disappointed. It was not one town, but 4 or 5 villages that had grown together and never bothered to become a proper city, with no great walls, no grand marketplace, and temples that were respectable rather than magnificent. A historian of the age remarked that if Sparta were ever abandoned, later generations looking at the ruins would refuse to believe it had ever been powerful, and he was quite right, because that is exactly what happened. The peculiar thing about Sparta is what it did next door. West over the mountains lay another rich valley, and rather than send its surplus population overseas as everyone else did, Sparta took the valley and kept the people in it. Those people, and others closer to home, became helots, not household slaves exactly, but a whole subject farming population tied to the land, who worked the estates and handed over a fixed share of the harvest every year. That decision solved Sparta's land problem permanently and created a much worse one, because the helots vastly outnumbered their masters, perhaps by 7 to 1, and they never stopped wanting their valley back. Everything else about Sparta follows from sitting on top of that. Because the Spartan citizens had to be ready at all times, they made readiness the whole of life. Their land was farmed for them, so they did not farm. Their trade was handled by a second class of free non-citizens who lived in the surrounding towns, so they did not trade. Sparta's own iron currency was famously bulky and worth almost nothing outside the valley, which discouraged both foreign luxury and private ambition and made bribery inconvenient, which was the point. What the citizen did instead, from the age of 7 until 60, was train. The upbringing was communal. Boys left home young and were raised in bands under older youths, taught to read and write enough for their needs, taught to sing and dance in formation, made to go barefoot and to wear the same single cloak in winter and summer, kept a little hungry so that they would learn to forage and be quick about it, and above all taught to obey immediately, to endure quietly, and to speak briefly. That last habit produced a regional style of speech so clipped and dry that the name of the valley gave English the word laconic. Asked to surrender, one Spartan force is supposed to have replied with a single syllable. The famous soup was black and made of pork and blood and vinegar, and a visitor who tried it observed that he now understood why the Spartans did not fear death. Grown men dined every night in messes of about 15, each contributing a fixed amount of barley, cheese, figs, and wine from his estate, and a man who could not pay his share lost his citizenship, which meant that the whole system rested, in the end, on land worked by people who hated it. Government was a strange machine with 4 moving parts, and it worked for a remarkably long time. There were 2 kings at once from 2 different families, hereditary, who led the army and handled the state religion, and who could keep an eye on each other, which was the idea. There was a council of elders, 28 men over 60, elected for life, who prepared business. There was an assembly of all the citizens, which voted, sometimes by shouting, with the loudest shout winning, judged by ear. And there were 5 annually elected overseers, ordinary citizens who had genuinely alarming powers, could summon a king to appear before them, and could put him on trial. Nobody designed it. It accumulated, and the Spartans preferred to say it had been handed to them entire by an ancient lawgiver, which is what people usually say about arrangements whose origins are lost. Spartan women were the scandal and the envy of the rest of Greece. Because the men were away or in barracks, women ran the estates, which meant they held property in their own names. And by the later period, they may have owned as much as 2/5 of the land in the state. Girls were fed properly, which was not universal elsewhere, and trained in running and wrestling and throwing, on the reasoning that strong mothers bear strong children. They spoke their minds in public. Athenian writers found all of this appalling and wrote about it constantly, which is generally a sign of fascination rather than distaste. As for the army, its reputation was earned. The Spartans were not supermen, and their equipment was no better than anybody else's, but they were the only Greeks who drilled. They could change formation on command, wheel, and advance in step to the sound of pipes, slowly, without shouting, which other Greeks found more frightening than any charge, because it looked like a machine and not like men. In their scarlet cloaks, with the long hair they grew as adults, combed before battle, they gave the whole Greek world a mental image of what an army ought to look like, and the image has not entirely faded even now. The cost of it was rigidity and a very small pool. Spartan citizens were never numerous, perhaps 8,000 or 9,000 at the peak, and the system that made each of them formidable also made each of them irreplaceable, and it slowly ate itself as estates concentrated in fewer hands. They also had an unhelpful reluctance to march far from home for long, because a Spartan army abroad was a Spartan army not standing over the Helots, and their whole society was arranged to prevent change, which works beautifully until the day change is required. Sparta led an alliance of most of the states of the southern peninsula, and by the end of the 6th century before Christ, it was, without argument, the leading military power of the Greek world. When a Greek city was in serious trouble, it wrote to Sparta. This will matter shortly, when the largest empire on earth begins to take an interest in the Aegean. But before that, we should go northeast across the mountains to the other city, the one that went the opposite way in almost every respect, noisy where Sparta was silent, commercial where Sparta was closed, addicted to argument, addicted to the sea, and in the middle of inventing something nobody had ever tried before. Before we go on to the other great city, it is worth remembering that Sparta and Athens were 2 towns out of 1,000, and that most Greeks lived in neither and thought both of them insufferable. On the narrow neck of land joining the southern peninsula to the mainland stood Corinth, which had 2 harbors facing opposite seas and had grown rich by the oldest method there is, which is standing where everyone has to pass. Rather than sail around the stormy capes of the south, a captain could unload at one harbor, have his cargo carted 4 miles overland and reloaded on the other side, and for smaller vessels there was a paved slipway with grooved stone tracks along which the whole ship was hauled on a wheeled cradle by teams of men and oxen. It ran for centuries. Corinth made the best bronze in Greece and exported pottery all over the Mediterranean, and it founded some of the wealthiest colonies in the West, and it hosted its own games every 2 years, and it had a reputation for luxury and sharp practice that other Greeks enjoyed complaining about while doing business there. To the north lay Thebes, in a fat plain of grain and cattle, a city with the oldest legends attached to it of anywhere in Greece and a persistent difficulty in being taken seriously by its neighbors, who like to call the Thebans slow. The Thebans were not slow. They simply had good farmland and saw no reason to go to sea, and when they finally organized themselves, they produced the general who ended Spartan supremacy in a single afternoon. Argos, in the south, had been the leading city of the whole region in the old days and never entirely got over it, and spent several centuries in a state of settled resentment towards Sparta, which is a long time to hold a grudge even by Greek standards. On the island of Aegina, a rock in the middle of the bay opposite Athens, a population of traders and shipowners minted the earliest coins in mainland Greece, stamped with a sea turtle, and made themselves so wealthy and so irritating to Athens that a philosopher once described the island as the eyesore of the harbor. Out on the Asian coast lay the cities of Ionia, and if you were looking for the cleverest place in the Greek world in the 6th century before Christ, you would have gone there and not to the mainland at all. Miletus alone founded something like 90 colonies around the Black Sea, ran a wool and textile industry, and produced the first 3 philosophers, the first prose writer, the first map of the world, and a town planner who invented the grid layout that is still the default way to build a city. Ephesus had a temple to the huntress goddess so enormous, with its 127 columns, that it was counted among the wonders of the world. Samos had the tunnel through the mountain, and a temple whose single surviving column stands in a marsh like a raised finger. Halicarnassus produced the first historian, and a century later a tomb so magnificent for a local ruler that his name, in the form of the word mausoleum, is still the word for any grand tomb anywhere on earth. And to the west, on the island of Sicily, Syracuse grew into a city larger and richer than Athens, with a harbor that could hold a fleet, quarries of golden stone, a theater cut into the rock, and a series of energetic rulers who fought off invasions from North Africa and hired the best poets in Greece to write about it afterwards. In the fields of southern Italy, Greek settlers built temples that are today the best preserved anywhere in the world, better than anything in Greece itself, standing in the meadows with the mountains behind them and nothing much around them but grass and wildflowers. 2 of them are so nearly intact that walking into one is the closest anybody alive can come to standing inside a working Greek temple. Then there were the peoples of the north and west, whom the city Greeks regarded as barely Greek at all, living in villages and tribal leagues rather than proper cities, up in the mountains where the weather comes from. And it is worth noting that in the end it was those unfashionable highland folk who ended up leading everybody, because the mountains kept producing tough people while the cities kept producing lawyers. And binding the whole quarrelsome collection together were the things they shared. 4 great athletic festivals on a rolling cycle, so that in any given year there was one to travel to. The sanctuary of the Oracle, run by a council of member states who took their turns. A common calendar of festivals for gods everyone recognized, even if the local version had a different mother or a different favorite animal. The palms, which everyone knew. And the language in its 4 or 5 broad dialects, which were different enough that an Athenian could hear a Spartan coming, and different enough to be affectionately mocked on the comic stage, and yet close enough that everybody understood everybody. They had a word for all the people who were not part of that, and it simply meant those whose speech sounds like meaningless syllables, which is a rather childish way to name your neighbors and has unfortunately had a long career. The Greeks themselves did not agree on what held them together. One writer put it as shared blood, shared language, shared temples and sacrifices, and shared customs, which is as good a definition of a people as anyone has managed since. What they never had and never wanted was one government. Every attempt to unite them was resented, resisted, and eventually undone, including the ones that worked. It is entirely possible that the reason so much was invented in so small a place in so short a time is exactly that: 1,000 independent laboratories, each convinced it was right, each watching the others closely, and none of them able to shut the others down. Athens had one enormous advantage that had nothing to do with anybody's cleverness. Its territory was large, about 1,000 square miles, a whole triangular peninsula of plains and low hills and coast, and it had been settled continuously since the Bronze Age without ever being conquered, which meant that its people genuinely believed they had grown out of their own soil rather than arriving from somewhere else. At the center stood a limestone rock with steep sides and a flat top, defensible, with a spring, which had been a Mycenaean citadel and was still ringed in places by walls of the giant blocks. Around it lay farmland and olive groves, 3 harbors a few miles off, and in the hills to the south, though nobody had yet realized how much of it there was, silver in the 7th century before Christ. Athens was governed by its noble families and was not doing especially well. The land was concentrating. Small farmers were borrowing against their own persons and losing. The countryside was dotted with stone markers recording that this field stood as security for a debt, and the mood was ugly. The first attempt at a fix was to write the laws down, which had never been done there before. And the man who did it produced a code so severe that his name became a byword for harshness for the next 26 centuries. It is said that when asked why nearly every offense carried the death penalty, he answered that small crimes deserved it and he could not think of anything worse for large ones. The laws did not solve the problem, but the act of writing them at all mattered. Once the law is on a board in the marketplace, it belongs to everybody, and no noble can tell you it says something else. The real reformer came a generation later, around 594 years before Christ. He was a well-born poet and merchant, trusted by both sides because both sides had read his verses complaining about the other, and he was given a year of extraordinary power to fix the state. He began by canceling every debt in Athens and pulling up the mortgage stones. He forbade the securing of loans on a person permanently, so that no Athenian could ever again be enslaved for debt. And he spent public money buying back those who had already been sold overseas. He sorted the citizens into 4 classes by how much their land produced, not by their birth, and opened the offices to the top classes regardless of family, which broke the aristocratic monopoly at a stroke. He set up a council to prepare business for the assembly, and a jury court where any citizen could bring a case on behalf of somebody who had been wronged, even a stranger, which is a small clause with a very long future. He banned the export of every crop except olive oil, which was the one crop Athens had a surplus of and which every kitchen in the Mediterranean wanted. Then, having been told from every direction what else he ought to do, he made everyone swear to keep the laws for 10 years, got on a ship, and left the country for a decade so that nobody could pressure him into amending them. Nobody was satisfied. Both sides felt cheated. That, he observed, was roughly what he had been aiming at. Within 30 years, Athens had a tyrant anyway, and he turned out to be one of the useful ones. He lent money to small farmers, encouraged the planting of olives on ground good for nothing else, sent judges out on circuit into the villages so that the poor did not have to walk into the city and stand in front of their landlord's cousin to get justice, minted excellent silver coins with an owl on them, brought water into the city through a covered aqueduct with a beautiful fountain house at. The end of it expanded the great festival of the wine god into a competition with prizes for the best performance, and had the poems of the heroes fixed in an official text and recited at the city's grandest festival every 4 years. He was, in short, the classic strongman, illegal, personally charming, and extremely good for the economy. His sons were less good at it, as sons of strongmen tend to be, and after some ugliness the family was thrown out with Spartan help in 510 before Christ. And then, in the confusion that followed, an Athenian noble did something nobody expected. Losing a power struggle among the great families, he went over the heads of the other nobles and took his program directly to the ordinary people and won, and then actually delivered what he had promised. What he delivered in 508 before Christ was the most artificial and most brilliant political reform of the ancient world. The trouble with Athenian politics was that people voted with their neighbors, and their neighbors were their cousins and their landlords, so the old families kept their blocks. So he abolished the old tribes and invented 10 new ones, and he built each new tribe out of 3 separate parcels of villages drawn from 3 different parts of the country, one from the coast, one from the inland farms, one from the city. Each tribe was therefore a deliberate mixture of fishermen, hill farmers, and city craftsmen who had never met, and no noble family's estate could dominate one. The village became the unit of citizenship, and a man was registered there and named after it for life, so that his identity as a citizen came from his local parish and not from his father's ancestry. Each tribe sent 50 men, chosen by lot, to a council of 500 that ran the daily business of the state and prepared everything the assembly would vote on. Chosen by lot. Not elected, because election favors the famous and the rich, but drawn by chance from those who put their names in, on the reasoning that any decent citizen can serve for a year, and that the office belongs to all of them in turn. The 50 men of one tribe were on duty for a tenth of the year, living and eating in a round building by the marketplace, with a third of them sleeping there every night, so that the state always had somebody awake. And the assembly, meeting on a bare hillside above the marketplace, with a stone platform to speak from, made the actual decisions, war, peace, treaties, taxes, public building, all of it, by a show of hands, several thousand men on a slope in the open air. They added one more tool, a strange and rather elegant one. Once a year the assembly could be asked whether it wished to hold a vote of banishment. If it said yes, then on a set day every citizen who wished to could scratch a name on a broken piece of pottery, which was the cheap scrap paper of the ancient world, and drop it in. If enough pieces were counted, the man whose name appeared most often had to leave the country for 10 years. He kept his property. He kept his good name. He simply had to go and be somewhere else for a decade. It was not a punishment for a crime. It was a way for a community to diffuse a rivalry that was tearing it apart, without bloodshed and without a trial. Thousands of those broken shards have been dug up, still bearing the scratched names, including one large batch found in a well, all bearing the same name and written in only a few different hands, which is the oldest surviving evidence of somebody organizing a smear campaign. Democracy was about 20 years old, and already somebody had thought of that. It is worth walking slowly through an ordinary year of that democracy, because the details are strange and rather beautiful, and because nothing on earth has ever worked quite like it since. The assembly met about 40 times a year on the bare hillside at dawn, and a quorum for certain votes was 6,000 men. Getting 6,000 farmers and shoemakers up a hill at first light is not a trivial problem, and the solution was pure Athens. On assembly mornings, a group of public slaves would sweep through the marketplace holding a long rope dipped in wet red dye, herding the loiterers towards the meeting, and any man who arrived with red paint on his cloak had to explain himself and lost his attendance. Payment. Anyone could speak. The herald asked the crowd who wished to address them, and a man stood up and put on a wreath which marked him as under the protection of the gods while he spoke, and said his piece, and was heckled if he deserved it. Then hands were counted. That was it. War, treaties, taxes, grain purchases, the building of temples, the sending of fleets, decided in the open air by a show of hands, with no party, no press, no second chamber, and no appeal. The courts were even stranger. There were no professional lawyers, no judges in our sense, and no state prosecutors. A citizen brought a case himself and spoke for himself, and if he was no good at speaking, he could pay a professional to write his speech for him and then memorize it. Which is why so many surviving speeches are written to sound like a plain, honest man who has certainly not hired anybody. The jury was not 12 people. It was 201, or 401, or 501, and for the most serious public cases, as many as 1,500, always an odd number, so there could be no tie. That size made bribery essentially impossible, which was the point. Jurors were paid a small daily wage, so the poor and the old could serve, and volunteering for jury duty became something of a hobby for retired men, which one comic playwright turned into an entire play about a father addicted to judging who has to be locked in his own house. And because the Athenians did not trust anybody, including themselves, they built a machine. It was a slab of stone with hundreds of narrow slots cut in it in columns, and each juror who turned up on the day dropped in a small bronze ticket with his name and his village punched on it. Then a tube down the side of the slab was filled with black and white balls, and released one at a time by a crank, and a white ball meant the whole row of tickets beside it served that day, and a black ball meant they went home. Not even the men who built the machine could predict which jurors would hear which case on the morning of the case in a city where everybody's cousin knew everybody. Several of those stone slabs have been dug up in the marketplace, slots and all. Speeches were timed by a water clock, a jar with a small bronze outlet that took about 6 minutes to empty, and when the water ran out, you stopped, and if a document had to be read aloud, the clerk plugged the outlet with wax so that the reading was not charged against your time. Voting was by 2 bronze discs on a stalk, one solid and one hollow, given to every juror, so that he could hold both and drop the one he chose into the counting jar with his fingers closed over the stalk, and nobody standing beside him could see which he had used. A secret ballot in the 5th century before Christ, thought through to the level of the shape of the disc. Public officials were mostly chosen by lot as well for a single year, and were not allowed to hold the same post twice. and at the end of the year, every one of them had to submit his accounts for examination and could not leave the country until they had been cleared. The generals were an exception and were elected because sortition is a fine principle right up until it hands you a fleet. The one thing this system did not do was write down a constitution and stop. It kept adjusting. Payment for jury service, then for the council, then eventually for attending the assembly itself, each step widening who could actually afford to take part. It made mistakes on a heroic scale, voted for wars it should have refused, and once condemned 6 of its own victorious generals in a single illegal mass trial after a storm prevented them from picking up survivors, and repented of it almost immediately, which did nobody any good. Its critics were savage and were allowed to publish. Almost every Greek political thinker whose work survives disliked democracy, which tells you 2 things: that clever men have always distrusted crowds, and that a system which tolerates that much published contempt for itself is a good deal more confident than its critics allow. And it lasted, with 2 brief interruptions, for nearly 2 centuries, not as an idea in a book. As a working arrangement that thousands of ordinary men turned up for before dawn to sit on a hillside in the wind and decide things. While the Greeks had been arguing about land reform, something very large had happened to the east. A single empire had swallowed the whole of the Near East, from the Indus to the Nile, an empire of roads and satraps and imperial post-riders, more populous and better organized than anything the world had yet seen, and its western edge now ran down the coast of Asia Minor, where a long string of prosperous Greek cities had been quietly absorbed. Those cities did not enjoy paying tribute, and in 499 before Christ they revolted. They asked the mainland for help. Sparta declined, on the sensible grounds that the place was 3 months inland and the whole business looked unwinnable. Athens sent 20 ships, and another city sent 5, and this small squadron went up country with the rebels and took part in the burning of the western capital of the empire, apparently by accident, and then went home. The revolt was crushed over the following years, but the burning was remembered. When the empire came west, it came in 2 waves. The first, in 490 before Christ, crossed the Aegean island by island and landed on the wide bay at Marathon, 26 miles from Athens, where the flat ground suited cavalry. Athens sent out its whole citizen levy, some 9,000 men, joined by 1,000 from a small neighboring city who came because they had promised to and who were the only allies to arrive in time. A runner was sent to Sparta, 140 miles across the mountains, which he is said to have covered in 2 days. Sparta, entirely in character, replied that it was in the middle of a religious festival and would come when the moon was full. For several days the 2 armies watched each other across the plain. Then the Athenians attacked, at a run over the last stretch to get through the arrow fire quickly, with their line deliberately thinned in the middle and thickened on both wings, so that the center gave ground and the wings swung inward and closed. The invasion force went back to its ships. Athens had on its own beaten the army of the great king, and the effect of that on Greek confidence is impossible to overstate. The Athenians buried their 192 dead in a mound on the battlefield rather than bringing them home, which was against all custom and was the highest honor the city could pay, and that mound is still there in the field, a low green hill you can walk around in about 4 minutes. 10 years later, the empire came back properly, with the new king leading in person. And this time it came by land around the top of the Aegean, with the fleet keeping pace along the coast. The ancient figures for the size of that army are absurd, running to millions, and modern estimates settle somewhere between 1 and 300,000 men, which for the age is still a staggering logistical achievement. They bridged a strait with boats lashed together and cables of flax and papyrus, and they dug a canal through the neck of a peninsula rather than risk rounding a cape where a fleet had once been wrecked. The Greeks who chose to resist, and it was only about 30 cities out of the 1,000, met and swore an alliance, and, remarkably, agreed to put Sparta in command of everything, including the fleet, which was mostly Athenian. Athens had a fleet at all because of a stroke of luck and a piece of stubborn persuasion. A new vein of silver had been struck in the hills to the south, and the assembly's first instinct was to distribute the windfall to every citizen as a cash payment, which would have been extremely popular. One politician argued instead for spending the entire sum on 200 warships. He won the vote by a margin nobody recorded, and it is fair to say that no assembly decision in history has ever paid off faster. The ship in question was the trireme, a long, narrow oared galley with 3 banks of rowers, 170 of them. A hull so light it could be carried up a beach by its own crew, and a bronze ram at the waterline. It could do better than 7 knots and turn in its own length. Every rower was a free citizen, mostly from the poorest class, paid a daily wage. And this, too, had consequences, because a city whose survival rests on its poorest men rowing in rhythm is going to find it very hard to tell those men that their opinion does not count. The first stand was made at a narrow pass between the mountains and the sea in the north, held by a Spartan king with 300 of his own citizens and several thousand other Greeks, while the combined fleet fought a holding action at a strait nearby. The pass held for 2 days against everything sent at it, because in a gap that narrowed the numbers on the other side meant nothing. On the 3rd day the position was turned by a mountain path, and the king sent the bulk of the allied army away and stayed with his 300 and about 1,000 others to hold the road while the rest got clear. They were surrounded, and they died there. Militarily, it changed little. Culturally, it changed a great deal, and a short inscription was later set up on the spot saying, in effect, that the passerby should tell the Spartans that their men were lying there in obedience to orders. Central Greece was now open. Athens was evacuated, the whole population moved to the islands and the coast, and the city was taken and burned, temples and all. And here the Greeks nearly lost by argument, because the allied commanders wanted to fall back to the isthmus and defend the southern peninsula, abandoning everything north of it. The Athenian commander is said to have maneuvered them into the fight he wanted, in the narrow strait between the mainland and the island of Salamis, where a huge fleet could not deploy, and the current and the morning wind favored the defenders. In that channel, on a September morning, the Greek fleet took the imperial fleet apart. The great king watched from a throne set up on the hillside opposite, which is one of the more remarkable details in the whole of ancient history, and afterwards he went home with part of his army, leaving a general behind with the rest. The following summer the Greeks put nearly 40,000 heavy infantry into the field, the largest Greek army that had ever assembled, and met that army near a small city in the northwest and destroyed it. And on what tradition insists was the same day, a Greek fleet caught the remnant of the imperial navy drawn up on a beach across the Aegean and burned it. And that was that. The invasion was over. A collection of small, quarrelsome, mutually suspicious towns with no central command had beaten the greatest power on earth twice, and they knew perfectly well that they should not have. The consequences ran in every direction. It gave the Greeks a story about themselves, about free men who fought because they chose to and obeyed only the law, which was flattering. Partly true and endlessly useful, it gave Athens a navy, enormous prestige, and the leadership of everyone with a coastline. It left Sparta uneasy, because Sparta had led the alliance and had somehow ended the war smaller than it started. And it left the Greek world with a habit it never quite lost, which was to measure everything afterwards against those 2 summers and to feel, in every generation that followed, that they had been born just slightly too late. What Athens did next was clever, generous, and in the long run, a slow disaster. With the empire beaten but not gone, the cities of the islands and the Asian coast wanted a permanent defense, and Athens offered to organize one. Delegates met on the small sacred island in the middle of the Aegean, where the treasury would be kept, and each member agreed to contribute either ships or an annual payment in silver. Larger states sent ships. Smaller ones, sensibly enough, found it easier to send money and let Athens do the sailing. Within about 15 years, almost everyone was sending money, and Athens had all the ships and all the trained crews and all the experience. When one island decided it had had enough and tried to leave, it was besieged, its walls pulled down, its fleet confiscated, and its status reduced. That set the pattern. A defensive league had turned into an empire without anybody passing a motion. In 454 before Christ, the treasury was moved from the sacred island to the rock at Athens for safekeeping. And from that point the tribute was Athenian revenue in all but name. And the Athenians, who were nothing if not thorough about paperwork, carved the accounts on great slabs of marble and set them up in public, every city, every year, every sum, 1/60th of it dedicated to the goddess. The empire's ledger survives because the imperial city decided to publish its receipts. This was the age of the man who dominated Athenian politics for 3 decades. He held no crown and no permanent office. He was simply elected general, one of 10 year after year, and he had to persuade the assembly of every single thing he wanted, every time, by standing on a stone platform in the open air and arguing for it. It is worth holding on to that. The most powerful man in Greece could be voted down on a Tuesday morning by farmers who had walked in from the hills. He introduced payment for jury service, which sounds trivial and was not, because a poor man cannot sit on a court for a day unless somebody covers what he loses by not working, and unpaid public service is a quiet way of reserving government for the comfortable. He completed the long walls, 2 parallel fortifications running 4 miles from the city down to the harbor, so that Athens and its port became a single fortified unit that could be supplied by sea for as long as the fleet held. And he took the tribute of the empire and spent an enormous slice of it on marble. The old temples on the rock had been burned in the invasion, and the Greeks had sworn not to rebuild them, but to leave them as a memorial. About 30 years later, Athens decided that the oath had been observed long enough. What went up between 447 and 432 before Christ is the most famous building in the world. It is a rectangular temple about 228 feet long. with 8 columns across each end and 17 down each side, and it is built almost entirely of white marble quarried from a mountain 11 miles away and brought down by ox cart on a specially made road. It has almost no straight lines in it. The columns swell very slightly about a third of the way up so that they do not look pinched. They lean inward by a few inches over their height so that they do not look as if they are falling outward, and if extended upward they would meet, according to one calculation, more than a mile above the building. The corner columns are slightly fatter than the rest, because a column seen against bright sky looks thinner than one seen against shadow. The whole floor is domed upward by about 4 inches in the middle, so that it does not appear to sag and so that rain runs off. Every one of those corrections exists to compensate for the errors of the human eye, and the effect is that a building made of stone and geometry manages to look alive. It was carved with sculpture on every available surface, and it was painted in strong reds and blues, which is the detail most people find hardest to forgive. Inside stood a statue of the city's goddess nearly 40 feet high, made of gold plates over a wooden core with ivory for the flesh, holding a winged figure of victory in her open right hand. The gold, about 2,500 pounds of it, was deliberately made removable, so that it could be taken off and weighed to prove nobody had stolen any, and so that in an emergency the state could in effect spend its own goddess. The building accounts were published on stone as usual, and from them we know that the workforce included citizens and foreigners and slaves working side by side, often at the same daily rate. And we know the price of everything. And we know that when a man fell from the scaffolding and was badly hurt, the state paid for his care. Around it grew the rest of the age, the gateway building with its coffered marble ceiling, the small temple with the porch of 6 draped women carrying the roof on their heads, the theater cut into the southern slope of the rock, the great festival every 4 years when the whole city processed up the hill with a new woven robe for the goddess carried like a sail. Athens in those years had perhaps 300,000 people in its territory, of whom maybe 40,000 were adult male citizens with the vote, and it was full of foreigners, because the empire had made it the busiest port in the Aegean. And the harbor smelled of pitch and saltfish and imported timber, and you could buy grain from the Black Sea, carpets from Asia, dates from the East, and ivory from Africa within 100 yards of each other. It was also, and this cannot be politely skated over, a slave society. Perhaps a third of the people in that territory were owned. Some were household servants, treated with rough familiarity and sometimes freed. Some worked beside their owners in workshops, and some, perhaps 10 or 20,000 of them, worked underground in the silver mines to the south, in galleries so low that a man could not stand, cutting ore by oil lamp in shifts of 10 hours. And their lives were short, and there is nothing to be said in defense of it. The same silver that paid for the fleet that saved Greek freedom was cut out by people who had none. The Greeks were capable of holding both those facts at once without apparent difficulty, and a very few of their philosophers noticed the contradiction and said so quietly and were ignored. It is right to say it plainly and then to go on, because a story that leaves it out is not the true one. It is worth staying a while with the making of things, because a temple on a hill is the last 5% of an enormous amount of patient, dusty, ordinary work, and the ordinary work is soothing to think about. Marble came out of the mountain by fire and wedge and water. The quarrymen cut a channel around the block with iron picks, working in a trench barely wide enough for shoulders, then drilled a line of holes along the bottom and drove in wooden wedges and soaked them. And the swelling wood split the stone along the line, cleanly, with a sound they must have known well. Half-finished columns still lie in the ancient quarries where they cracked and were abandoned, and one enormous unfinished statue lies on its back on an island hillside, with the grass grown up around it, 30 feet long, waiting since the 6th century before Christ for a crew that never came back. The blocks came down the mountain on sledges and on carts with wheels 10 feet across, on roads built for the purpose, with teams of oxen in front, and on the steepest stretches, teams of men behind holding the load back with ropes wound around posts. Column drums were sometimes fitted with wooden collars and simply rolled. On site, blocks were lifted with cranes of timber and rope and pulley, worked by a windlass or a treadwheel. And the lifting points are still visible on the stones, a pair of shallow slots for iron tongs, or a hole cut in a swallowtail shape into which a 3-piece iron key was dropped and spread. Once a block was in place, the mason cut those marks away and dressed the surface, and the final polishing of a temple was done after the whole thing stood, from the top down. The drums of a column were joined without mortar, faced against each other so precisely that the joint is invisible, and centered with a square wooden peg in a socket at the middle, often of cypress, some of which are still in there. When the great earthquakes came over the centuries, the columns did not shatter. They danced, drum on drum, and often stayed up. Bronze was the other great craft. A statue began as a clay core, roughly the shape of the figure, over which the sculptor modeled a skin of wax, perhaps 1/4 of an inch thick, and worked every detail into the wax, since the wax was what would become the metal. Then the whole thing was encased in fine clay, with rods pinning the core to the outer mold and vents left, and the whole assembly baked so the wax ran out and the mold hardened. Molten bronze went in, filled the gap where the wax had been, and when the mold was broken away, there was the figure hollow, with the core still rattling about inside. The parts were cast separately and joined, and the eyes were set in with white stone and colored glass, and the lashes cut from thin sheet, and the lips and nipples were inlaid in copper for color, and the teeth were sometimes silver. Nothing in a museum prepares you for the fact that a Greek bronze originally looked like a warm brown living body with wet-looking eyes. 2 of them came out of the sea off the coast of southern Italy in 1972, found by a man on holiday with a snorkel, and they are as good as anything ever made. Pottery was industrial by comparison, and Athens ran the trade. The potter's quarter lay just outside the walls, a district of workshops and kilns and clay pits, and its name is still the name of the district today. The clay of the region fires to a strong orange red and takes a slip that turns glossy black in the kiln, and the whole miracle of Greek pottery is one firing in 3 stages, oxygen in, then the vents closed, and green wood added to fill the chamber with smoke so that everything turns black, then the vents opened again so that the coarse body reoxidizes to red while the fine painted slip. Centered smooth, stays black. Getting that wrong ruins a kiln load. Getting it right made a city famous. The painters signed their work, sometimes with cheerful competitive remarks about a rival painter, and a name scratched on a pot in a workshop is how we know several hundred otherwise entirely lost individuals. The man who liked to paint dogs, the one who drew the best hands, the one who could not do feet and turned the figure sideways to hide it. Then there was the silver, The mines to the south of Athens went down through the limestone on shafts more than 300 feet deep, sunk by hand, with galleries running off them following the ore seam and ventilation shafts paired so that air moved, and lamps that held enough oil for a 10-hour shift. Which is how the shift length was decided. The ore was hauled up in baskets, crushed, washed in a beautiful cascade of shallow stone tanks and channels designed so that the water was recycled again and again because that country has no water to spare, and then smelted and cupelled with lead to separate the silver. Those washing tables are still there in the scrub. Their cement floors and settling basins intact, and they are marvels of design built by people who were never named, using labor that was mostly enslaved, and the honest way to look at them is with admiration and shame in about equal measure. And water. Every Greek city's real problem was water in August. They solved it with rock-cut cisterns under every courtyard, with public fountain houses fed by covered channels from springs miles away, with dams and terracing on the hillsides to keep the winter rain from taking the soil down to the sea, and, in the ambitious cities, with tunnels driven straight through hills, surveyed from both ends, with sight lines and geometry that would satisfy a modern engineer. Around all of it moved the small trades that make a town work and almost never get written about. The tanner outside the walls because of the smell, the fuller treading cloth in tubs, the charcoal burners up in the woods keeping their mounds smoldering for days without sleep, the woman selling garlands at the gate, the man who rented out donkeys, the bakers, the sandal makers, the fish sellers who were universally believed to be dishonest, the barbers whose shops were the news exchange of every neighborhood, and the flute girls and acrobats hired for evenings. When a comic playwright wanted a joke that everyone would get, he said it in one of those shops. That is where nearly everybody lived. Not on the hillside voting, and not in the marble, but in a low room off a courtyard making something with their hands. In a town of a few thousand people where they knew every face, under a sky that was reliably blue for 8 months of the year, with the sea a couple of hours' walk away and the same mountain on the horizon that their grandparents had looked at. The philosophy and the marble grew out of that, and not the other way round. Let us step off the public stage now and go into an ordinary house, because the daily life of these people is the gentlest part of the story and the part most worth falling asleep inside. A Greek house was not grand, even in the richest quarter of the richest city. The street front was a blank wall of mud brick on a stone footing with a plain door and no windows worth mentioning, because everything faced inward. Through the door was a small open courtyard, paved or beaten earth, with a drain, an altar for the household gods, and often a well or a cistern that caught the winter rain from the roof tiles. Around that courtyard, the rooms. The house was cool in summer because the court shaded itself, and cold in winter, and the answer to cold was a portable brazier of charcoal, wool clothing, and going to bed early. Furniture was sparse and good, a few chests, since there were no cupboards, low tables that slid under the couches when not in use, stools and beds of woven leather straps on a wooden frame with a wool mattress. Floors were earth or plaster or, in the better houses, pebble mosaic. Lighting was the little clay lamp we began with, and one lamp gives about as much light as a single candle, which is why the ancient day ended when the sun did. The kitchen was a corner with a hearth and a hole in the roof. Meals were plain and mostly the same. Breakfast was bread dipped in wine. The staple was barley. which does not rise, so it was made into flat cakes or into a kind of thick paste, and wheat bread was the treat for those who could afford imported grain. With it went olives, cheese, onions, garlic, lentils, chickpeas, beans, figs fresh in season and dried the rest of the year, and whatever the household grew. Fish was the great luxury of the coast, and the fish market was where the city's most enjoyable arguments happened. Meat was for festivals, and almost all of it came from sacrifice, so that eating beef was a religious event, and a poor man might taste it only a few times a year, and the smell of roasting on a feast day would have carried across a whole neighborhood. Wine was drunk by everyone, including children, and always mixed with water, usually 1 part wine to 3 or 4 of water, and drinking it neat was considered the mark of a barbarian and a fool. The evening entertainment of men with leisure was the drinking party, held in a room with couches around the walls, and the floor sloped very slightly to a drain, because floors get spilled on. Guests reclined on the left elbow, 2 to a couch. A master of ceremonies was chosen, sometimes by dice, and he decided how strong the mixture would be and how many bowls the evening would run to. There was music, usually a double pipe, and riddles, and a game that involved flicking the last drops of wine from your cup at a target, which sounds ridiculous and was taken extremely seriously. And there was conversation, which is why so much Greek philosophy is written as talk after dinner. Women of citizen families ran the household and did not attend those parties, and in the stricter cities they went out mainly for festivals, funerals, and the fountain. This can be overstated. Poor women had to work, and worked in the market and in the fields, and everyone's mother went to the temple. And the great religious festivals were often theirs alone. But the shape of a respectable woman's life was the house, and the work of the house was wool. It is hard to convey how much wool. Every thread of every garment in a household was spun by hand, on a stick and a weighted whorl, and then woven on an upright loom where the warp threads hang under rows of clay weights, and those weights are one of the commonest finds on any Greek site. A woman with a spindle could work while talking, while watching children, while supervising. A single cloak represented weeks. Clothing itself was simple to the point of genius. Rectangles of cloth, pinned at the shoulders and belted, falling into the folds you see on every statue, and a heavier rectangle wrapped over it as a cloak. Nothing was cut, and very little was sewn, so cloth was never wasted, and a garment could be rebelted for a different look, and color came from madder and saffron and shellfish purple for those who could pay for it. Children played with rattles, pull-along carts on wheels, knucklebones, hoops, tops and dolls with jointed arms and legs. And the small clay figures found in their graves are the objects in any museum most likely to make a visitor stop and go quiet. Boys of citizen families went to school from about 7, not run by the state but paid for by the family, and learned letters and music on the lyre, because a man who could not take his turn with the instrument at dinner was thought half-educated. And athletics at the wrestling ground. They learned enormous quantities of poetry by heart, which is why a speaker in a courtroom could quote 100 lines and be confident the jury would follow. Girls learned at home, and in some cities learned to read, and in one island city a woman was running what amounts to a school of poetry for girls as early as the 6th century before Christ. And her surviving fragments are the most quietly devastating love poetry in the language. The city's other great institution was the gymnasium, which was a shaded courtyard and a running track and a bathing area where men exercised, oiled themselves, scraped the oil and dust off with a curved bronze tool, and talked all day. Philosophy grew there as much as anywhere, because a philosopher needs an audience with time on its hands. Outside the city, the year turned on the farm calendar, and it is a soothing calendar. Autumn brought the first rains and the plowing with a light scratch plow drawn by a yoke of oxen and the sowing of barley and wheat by hand. Winter was for pruning the vines, cutting wood, mending tools, and the long evenings. Late winter into spring, the olive trees flowered, and the grain grew, and the sheep lambed, and the goats were milked, and the cheese was made and pressed in baskets. Early summer was the harvest, cut with a curved sickle, bound in sheaves, carried to the threshing floor, which was a circle of beaten earth or stone on a windy ridge, where oxen walked round and round over the ears, and then the mixture was thrown into the air with a wooden fork so that the wind carried the chaff away and the grain fell straight down. Threshing is one of the oldest and most beautiful pieces of practical physics anybody ever worked out, and it looks like a dance. High summer was the grapes trodden in a vat, the juice run into jars sealed with clay and pine resin. And then late in the year, the olives knocked down with long poles onto cloth spread under the trees and crushed under a great round stone and pressed, and the oil left to settle. Oil for food, for lamps, for skin, for the athletes, for the dead. A Greek farmer's whole year, in the end, ran on one tree and the weather. Travel was slow and pleasant to imagine. Roads were tracks. Most people walked, and a donkey carried the load, and 20 miles was a long day. By sea, a merchant ship could make perhaps 4 or 5 knots with a following wind, and would hug the coast and pull into a beach at night wherever possible. And nobody sailed at all between November and March if they could help it, so the Mediterranean simply closed for the winter, and the whole world got quieter. Time was measured by the sun, and the hour was not a fixed thing, but a twelfth of the daylight. So a summer hour was long, and a winter hour was short. And a man agreeing to meet you in the market at the time the market fills was being about as precise as anyone needed to be. And beyond the house and the farm there was always the sea, which for these people was not scenery, but the working world, and it is a good thing to drift on for a while. A Greek merchant ship was a small, round, deep, unglamorous vessel, perhaps 60 or 80 feet long, broad in the beam, with a single square sail on one mast, and a pair of great steering oars at the stern instead of a rudder. It could not sail close to the wind, so a voyage was less a straight line than a series of patient waits in sheltered bays for the wind to come round. Cargo went in pottery jars with pointed bottoms, which sounds absurd until you see them stacked in a hold where the point of one sits neatly into the gap between the necks of 3 below, so that the whole cargo locks itself together and cannot shift in a swell. Those jars are the shipping containers of the ancient world, and marine archaeologists can identify where a wreck's cargo came from by the shape of its jars alone, because every region made a slightly different one and never changed it. The hulls themselves were built in a way that has almost died out. Instead of raising a skeleton and planking it, the Greek shipwright built the shell first, joining plank to plank edgewise with thousands of little wooden tongues fitted into slots and locked with pegs, so precisely that the hull held its shape before a single internal frame went in. It took enormous labor and produced a hull as strong and smooth as a nutshell. When divers found a merchant ship of about the 4th century before Christ off the coast of Cyprus, with its cargo of 400 wine jars and a bundle of almonds and a set of 4 lead weights, the joinery under the sea-worn planks was still tight after 2,300 years. Navigation was by coast, by memory, and by the sky. There were no charts worth the name and no compass, so a captain steered by known headlands, by the shape of a particular mountain seen from the water, by the color and smell of the sea, by the flight of birds, and at night by the stars, and specifically by the little cluster of the Bear turning around the pole, which one poet noted is the only constellation that never goes for a bath in the ocean. Sailing was a summer business. From late autumn to early spring, the weather in that sea turns hard and the visibility fails, and the whole Mediterranean simply shut down. And merchants sat at home going over their accounts, and everybody's news stopped for 4 months. The farmer poet gave sailing directions in his poem about the working year, and his advice was blunt. Sail in the 50 days after the summer solstice, when the winds are steady, and haul your ship well up the beach afterwards, and wedge stones under it, and pull the plug out of the bilge so the rain drains, and hang the steering oars up in the smoke of your hearth to keep them sound. He also advised putting most of your goods on somebody else's ship and only a little on your own, which is the first insurance policy in European literature. The people of the water were fishermen more than anything, and the sea gave them tunny running in shoals along the coast in season, watched for from towers on the headland, and sardines and anchovy and squid and eels and octopus, and the shellfish that gave both purple dye and dinner. It gave sponges, dived for on a held breath, with a flat stone to carry a man down fast, a trade that went on unchanged from the Bronze Age into living memory. It gave salt from evaporating pans, and it gave the great trade in grain that fed the cities sailed down from the rich black earth of the north. Because Athens at its height could feed perhaps a third of its people from its own fields, and had to buy the rest, which is the real reason its navy could never be allowed to lose. What the wrecks show is that no ship carried only one thing. A single hull might hold wine from the islands, oil from the mainland, salt fish from the Black Sea, timber and pitch, a stack of new pottery packed in straw, some scrap bronze for recycling, a few luxury goods, and the personal chest of the captain with his weights and his little folding balance, and one nice cup. There would be no passengers as such, only people who had negotiated to sleep on deck. There would be a pot of coals for cooking, and a millstone for grinding grain aboard, and a lead-sounding weight with a hollow in the bottom filled with tallow, so that when it came back up, it brought a smear of the sea floor with it, and an experienced captain could look at that smear and tell you where he was. Everything about it is small, practical, and thought through by generations of people who could not afford to be wrong. That is the world in which the ideas moved. Philosophy did not travel by lecture tour. It traveled in the same hold as the almonds, which brings us to the gods, because the Greek year was a religious year, and the two cannot be separated. Greek religion had no scripture, no creed, no church, and no professional priesthood in our sense. It had stories, and it had things you did. The stories were not doctrine. They came in dozens of local versions, contradicting one another cheerfully, and a poet could reshape one without offending anybody, because what mattered was not what you believed about the gods, but whether you gave them their due. The family of the great gods lived on the highest mountain in the north, a real mountain with a real cloud cap, and they were imagined as an extended household with all the frictions of one. There was the king of the sky and the weather, holder of the thunderbolt, protector of guests and of oaths, which meant that hospitality to a stranger was not merely good manners, but a religious obligation. And this idea runs through everything the Greeks wrote. There was his sister and wife, goddess of marriage, his brother the sea, whose temper was the sea's temper, and who was also, oddly, the god of horses and of earthquakes, so that people spoke of the earth shaker and the shaking of the ground and the surf against the cliffs as one being. Another brother ruled the dead, and his kingdom was not a place of punishment, mostly, but a gray and quiet place where the shades went on faintly, which the Greeks did not look forward to. There was the goddess who came out of the sea, and the god of the sun, and of music, and of prophecy, and of plague, both the arrow and the healing, whom nobody ever quite pinned down. There was the huntress of wild places, the god of the forge who was lame and made everything beautiful in the world, the messenger with winged sandals, who was also the patron of travelers, merchants, and thieves, which shows a certain realism. There was the goddess of the grain, whose daughter went down into the earth and came back, which is winter and spring, in the form of a mother and her child. And there was the god of the vine and of theater and of the loss of oneself in a crowd, who arrived from somewhere else and was never quite tame. What you did about them was sacrifice. An animal was led to the altar, decked and clean, water was sprinkled, and if it dipped its head, this was taken as consent. There was a moment of silence and a prayer, and then the animal was killed swiftly. And the thigh bones wrapped in fat were burned for the gods, and everything else was roasted and eaten by the community. That is the essential point. A sacrifice was a barbecue. It was the way ordinary people got meat, and the way a city ate together, and the smoke going up was the God's share of a family meal. Beside the great sacrifices there were small daily things, a cake left at a crossroads, wine poured on the ground before drinking, a word at the household altar, a lock of hair cut and dedicated when a child grew up. Some sanctuaries belonged to all the Greeks, and these were the places where the scattered nation met. High on the flank of a mountain in central Greece, above a valley of olive trees that runs to the sea, lay the oracle. People came from everywhere, from cities and from kings far outside the Greek world, and waited their turn, and the question was put, and a priestess seated over a cleft in the rock in the innermost room gave the answer. Geologists working there found faults crossing directly under the temple and traces of light hydrocarbon gases in the spring water, which may or may not explain anything. The answers were famously ambiguous, and the two mottos carved at the entrance were an instruction to know yourself and a warning that nothing should be done to excess, which between them summarized the whole of Greek ethics in 7 words. Around the sanctuary, the cities built little marble treasuries to house their offerings, competing with each other in taste and expense, so that the sacred way up the hill was effectively an avenue of showing off. Away to the southwest, in a quiet green valley with 2 rivers, lay the other great meeting place, where the games were held every 4 years in honor of the king of the gods. They may have begun as early as 776 before Christ, which the Greeks later used as the starting point of their whole calendar, and they went on for more than 1,000 years. A truce was declared across the Greek world for the duration, so that competitors and spectators could travel safely even between cities at war. And while the truce did not stop wars, it did protect the roads. The events were a foot race the length of the stadium, longer races, wrestling, boxing, the pentathlon, a brutal all-in event, and the chariot races, where the prize went not to the driver, but to the owner of the horses, which meant that a woman barred from attending in person could and did win an Olympic victory by entering a team. The prize was a wreath of wild olive cut with a golden sickle by a boy with both parents living. That was all. Everything else came afterwards, at home, where a victor might be given free meals for life, or have the city wall opened to let him in on the reasoning that a town with such a man in it did not need that section of wall. Then there were the mysteries, and here the Greeks kept a secret so well that we still do not have it. At a town on the coast near Athens, every autumn, thousands of initiates walked 14 miles along a sacred road, fasted, drank a barley and mint preparation, and entered a great hall in the dark, where something was shown to them. Everyone who took part was sworn to silence, and the penalty was severe, and for something like 2,000 years, across an entire literate civilization, nobody wrote down what was shown. All that comes through is the effect, person after person saying that afterwards they were no longer afraid of dying. Whatever happened in that hall? It was the only Greek religious experience that promised the individual something, and it was open to women, to foreigners, and to the enslaved, which in that world made it extraordinary. Death itself was handled quietly. The body was washed and dressed and laid out at home, and mourned and carried out before dawn, and buried or burned outside the walls along the roads leading out of the city, so that everyone entering or leaving passed the graves of their families. A coin was sometimes placed in the mouth for the ferryman. Offerings of oil were poured at the grave in little narrow-necked jars, and those white oil jars, painted with a single figure standing at a tomb, are the tenderest objects the Greeks made. The tombstones themselves show a quiet scene, a seated woman taking a jewel box from a servant, a man clasping hands with his son, a dog waiting. No horror, no triumph, just an ordinary moment held, and behind the gods stood the stories, which the Greeks did not treat as scripture and did not treat as fiction either, but as something in between, the deep past, half remembered, endlessly retold, and available to be argued with. They began in the version the farmer poet wrote down, with a yawning emptiness, and then the earth, broad and steady, and the night, and from them the sky. And from the earth and the sky, an older family of gods, enormous and elemental, who ruled before the ones people sacrificed to. The youngest of that older family overthrew his father, and then, warned that he would be overthrown in turn by his own child, swallowed each of his children as they were born, until his wife wrapped a stone in swaddling and handed him that instead, and hid the baby in a cave on Crete, where nurses raised him and armed men clashed their shields outside so that the crying would not be heard. That baby grew up and freed his brothers and sisters and fought the old gods for 10 years and won, and the new order was installed on the mountain in the north. It is a violent, strange, deeply old story, and versions of it turn up in older Near Eastern texts 1,000 years earlier, so it came west with the trade and settled in Greek soil. Then came the part the Greeks liked best, which was the ordering of the world and the awkward position of human beings in it. One of the older gods, a clever one who had chosen the winning side, made himself the advocate of mortals, tricked the king of the sky over the division of the sacrifice so that people would keep the good meat and the gods would get the bones and fat, and then, when fire was withheld in retaliation, stole it back inside a fennel stalk and gave it to us anyway. His punishment was long and awful, and he bore it, and centuries later, a playwright put him on stage as the first character in literature to be tortured by power for the crime of helping the weak, which is a remarkable thing to have staged in a theater at a religious festival with the officials in the front row. There were ages of the world, said the poets, each worse than the last, a golden age when the earth gave everything freely and people lived without labor and died as if falling asleep, then silver, then bronze, then an age of heroes, and then the present age of iron, which was full of work and worry, and in which children do not respect their parents. Every civilization has written that last paragraph at some point. The age of heroes is where the great cycles sit. There is the boy raised by a centaur who sailed with a crew of the best men of the age in a ship built with a talking timber in her prow, to fetch a golden fleece from a kingdom at the far end of the Black Sea, which is a story that maps almost exactly onto the real Greek push into that sea for gold and grain, and which contains. In its account of prospectors laying fleeces in mountain streams to catch the gold dust in the wool, a detail that turns out to be an actual mining technique used in that region. There is the strong man with a lined skin, condemned to a set of impossible labors, each of which is set in a real place and served as a foundation story for the local festival there. There is the hero of Athens who went into the labyrinth on Crete, which is what a mainland Greek would naturally make of a rambling many-roomed palace and its bulls, remembered dimly across the dark centuries. There is the woman whose face launched the fleet, and the long siege, and the wooden horse, which is not in the great poem about the siege at all, but in a few lines of the other one, mentioned in passing as something everybody already knew. And there's the 10-year journey home afterwards, with the island of the enchantress and the one-eyed giant, and the singing on the rocks, and the 20 years waiting, which is the oldest story anybody tells about wanting to get back to an ordinary house and an ordinary bed. What is interesting is what the Greeks did with these stories once they had philosophy. They did not throw them out. They argued with them. One early thinker complained that the poets had attributed to the gods every shameful thing that men do, and pointed out that if oxen could paint, their gods would look like oxen, which is a devastating remark to have made 2,500 years ago. Historians tried to work out which parts had really happened and generally decided that there had been a war at that city and that the rest was decoration. Playwrights took a myth everyone knew and changed the ending to make an argument. Philosophers read them as allegory. And ordinary people went on telling them to children at bedtime, which is, in the end, how every one of them survived. Because a story only needs one person in each generation to think it worth repeating in the dark to somebody who is nearly asleep. There is one more kind of sanctuary to visit before we leave the gods, and it is the gentlest place in the whole of Greek religion, which is the healing shrine, scattered across the Greek world at quiet sites away from the cities. In valleys with good water and pine woods around them stood the sanctuaries of the god of medicine, a figure who had begun as a mortal physician so skilled that the stories made him a son of the god of the sun and eventually a god himself. The greatest of them lay in a fold of hills in the northeast of the southern peninsula, and it was, to put it plainly, a hospital run as a place of worship. And it worked something like a spa. A sick person traveled there, sometimes for many days. On arrival, they were not treated. They were made to wait. They washed in the sacred spring, made a modest offering, usually a cake or a small animal or a token, and spent time in the sanctuary walking the grounds, which were extensive and calm, and included a stadium, a gymnasium, hot and cold baths, guest houses for hundreds of visitors, and one of the finest theaters ever built, whose 55 rows of limestone seating are still so acoustically perfect that a whisper at the center carries to the back row, and which was there because the priests understood that watching a play is part of getting well. Then, when the person was calm and rested and had been in the place long enough to believe in it, came the night in the sleeping hall. The hall was a long colonnaded building with couches in it. The patient lay down in the evening, in the dark, in a state of considerable expectation, and slept, and the God was expected to come to them in a dream, either to heal them directly or to tell them what to do. In the morning, the priests helped interpret whatever had been dreamed, and the treatment that followed was usually some sensible combination of diet, bathing, exercise, herbal preparations, rest, and a change of habits, delivered with the full authority of a divine instruction, which no doubt improved compliance enormously. Around the walls of the sanctuary stood stone tablets recording the cures, put up by the priests as advertisements and preserved for us as one of the strangest documents of the ancient world. They record a woman who had been pregnant for 5 years and dreamed the God asked her what else she wanted, and gave birth in the morning to a son who immediately washed himself in the spring, which is not a claim any modern hospital would risk making. They record a man who came to be cured of baldness, and one who was cured of blindness, and one who dreamed a dog licked his eye. They record, quite touchingly, a man who came to be cured of an obviously incurable condition and was told in his dream to go home and stop worrying about it. And they record failures too, occasionally, and 1 or 2 skeptics who were said to have arrived mocking and left cured, which is exactly the kind of story the management of any institution likes to keep on the wall. Around these shrines, people left small models in terracotta or marble of whatever part of them had been ill: hands, feet, ears, eyes, legs, a torso, thousands upon thousands of them, so that the storerooms of the museums are full of small clay body parts, each one representing one person's ordinary private hope on one particular afternoon. It is impossible to look at a shelf of them and not feel the whole crowd of them standing behind you. And at the same time, on an island in the Eastern Sea, in a sanctuary belonging to the same God. A different tradition was growing that would eventually make the dreams unnecessary. The physicians there began to insist that diseases have natural causes, that the falling sickness, which everyone called the sacred disease, was no more sacred than any other illness and came from the body like all the rest, and that the physician's job was to observe carefully, write everything down, help the body's own tendency to heal, and above all, do no harm. Their case notes survive, and they are unsentimental to the point of bleakness, recording plainly which patients recovered and which did not, day by day, which is exactly what makes them medicine rather than magic. So the two things sat side by side for centuries at the same God's shrines, without anybody feeling the need to resolve it. The careful notes and the long walk and the theater and the pine trees and the night in the sleeping hall with several hundred hopeful people breathing quietly in the dark, waiting to be told that they were going to be all right. Out of the festival of the wine god came the theater, and the theater came out of a chorus. Originally, a group of men sang and danced a story in a circle. Then, at some point, somebody stepped out of the chorus and answered it, and there were 2 voices instead of 1, and drama existed. A second actor was added, and then a third, and since each actor wore a mask and could change it, 3 men could play a dozen parts. The theater itself was a hollowed hillside with wooden and later stone benches curving around a flat circular dancing floor, with a low building behind it for changing and for painted scenery. The one below the Rock at Athens held perhaps 14,000 people, and the acoustics of these theaters are famously good enough that a coin dropped in the center can be heard in the top row, achieved with nothing but geometry and limestone. Plays were performed in daylight, in competition, over a few days each spring. 3 tragedies and a light satyr piece from each of 3 playwrights, with a jury and a prize. The whole city came. The state paid for the poorest citizen seats. Of the many hundreds of plays written, 32 tragedies survive, by 3 men, and they are still performed everywhere on earth. What is startling about them is not their antiquity, but their subject matter. A general who comes home victorious and is destroyed by what he did to win. A woman who defies the state to bury her brother and is right and is destroyed anyway. A king who investigates a crime with great energy and discovers that he is the criminal. Refugees begging for asylum while a city debates whether it can afford to be decent. They were watched by the same men who would vote in the assembly the following week, and the plays are quietly ferocious about the assembly. One playwright staged a piece about the invasion from the point of view of the invaders' mothers waiting for news, 8 years after he had fought in the battle himself. Comedy came in beside it, and it was outrageous. Living politicians were named and mocked from the stage while sitting in the audience. Philosophers were guyed. There were choruses of frogs, of clouds, of wasps, of birds building a city in the sky. One comedy has the women of Greece end a war by organizing. Another has a peasant fly to heaven on a dung beetle. The freedom of speech in those plays is the best evidence anyone could ask for that the democracy meant it. The same impulse to look hard at things produced the sculpture. It began with stiff, standing figures borrowed from Egypt, arms at the sides, 1 foot forward, a fixed smile. Within about 80 years, the Greeks had solved the human body. They noticed that a person standing at rest puts the weight on one leg, which drops one hip and raises the other, which curves the spine and shifts the shoulders, and once you carve that, stone starts to breathe. The great bronzes were cast hollow by the lost wax method and are the finest things they made, and almost every one was melted down at some point in the following 2,000 years for its metal, which is why nearly all the famous Greek statues in the world's museums are Roman marble copies of lost bronze originals. The few real ones we have were mostly fished out of the sea from ancient shipwrecks, which is a strange thought. The best Greek sculpture survived because it sank. Painting on pottery went the same way, from stiff black silhouettes with details scratched in to the reverse technique where the figures are left in the red clay and the background is painted black, which let the artist draw the details with a brush instead of a needle, and suddenly there are muscles and folds of cloth and 3/4 faces and a boy vomiting at a party while a friend holds his forehead. And then there is the thinking, which is the part that would not stop. It started on the Asian coast, in the trading cities, where a man around 600 before Christ asked what everything was made of and answered wrongly that it was all water. The answer does not matter. The question is the entire point, because he was the first person we know of to try to explain the world without saying that a God did it. After him, It came in a flood. One said the underlying stuff was air, one said fire, and that everything is in flux and you cannot step into the same river twice. One said the opposite, that change is an illusion and reality is one and unchanging, and posed a set of puzzles about motion that mathematicians only truly settled in the 19th century. One proposed that everything is made of tiny, indivisible particles moving in empty space, which was a lucky guess of the most spectacular kind. Another, working with a religious brotherhood, found that number underlies music, that a string stopped at exactly half its length sounds the same note higher, and concluded that the universe was mathematical, which is either mysticism or the foundation of physics, depending on the century you say it in. Meanwhile, others invented history. One traveler wrote a long, gossipy, generous book about the invasion that includes everything he was told about Egypt and Scythia and India, whether he believed it or not, and he says so when he does not, which makes him the father of the discipline and also its first honest man. A generation later, an Athenian general wrote about the war he had fought in and lost a command in, and stripped out the gods and the marvels entirely, and looked for causes in fear and interest and pride, and wrote that he had composed it not to win a prize, but as a possession for all time, which is arrogant and turned out to be accurate. On an island in the East, a school of doctors began writing case notes, plain records of what a patient looked like on the 3rd day and the 5th day and the 9th, without demons, and left an oath about doing no harm that is still read out at graduations. And in Athens, in the marketplace, an ugly, barefoot, endlessly irritating stonemason's son began stopping people and asking them what they meant by the words they used every day, and demonstrating that they did not know. He wrote nothing. He taught for nothing. He said that the unexamined life was not worth living, and that he knew only that he knew nothing, and after the long war. In a frightened and defeated city, he was tried on a charge of impiety and corrupting the young, and convicted by a narrow margin, and could have escaped and refused on the grounds that a citizen does not get to obey only the laws he likes. His death in 399 before Christ shamed his student into 40 years of writing, and that student founded a school in an olive grove outside the walls and taught a young man from the north who founded another school, and who then proceeded to write about physics, astronomy, weather, ethics, politics, poetry, logic, and the anatomy of about 500 species of animal, including a startlingly accurate account of the development of a chick in the egg, which he obtained by opening one egg a day for 3 weeks. That is what the Greeks did with their leisure. And while all of that was being made, the Greeks spent 27 years destroying it. The long war between Athens and Sparta began in 431 before Christ, and its causes were the ordinary causes, an alliance system that dragged distant quarrels into the center. A trade embargo against a small neighbor, an incident over a colony far to the west, and beneath all of it, the simple fact that Athenian power had grown and Sparta was frightened. The Athenian historian said exactly that, and it remains the most quoted sentence ever written about why wars start. Strategically, the two sides could barely reach each other. Sparta had the finest army in Greece and no fleet worth the name. Athens had the finest fleet and no wish at all to meet Spartans in a field. So Athens adopted a plan of deliberate patience. Bring the whole rural population of the countryside inside the walls every summer, let the enemy burn the crops, and go home when their farmers needed harvesting. and meanwhile use the Navy to raid the enemy coast and keep the grain ships coming from the Black Sea. It was a sound plan, and it had one flaw, which nobody could have predicted. In the second summer of the war, with a population of an entire county packed into a walled city in the heat, a sickness arrived through the port. It burned through Athens for 2 years, killing perhaps a quarter or a third of the people, including the man whose plan it was. The historian caught it himself and recovered, and wrote down the symptoms carefully so that it might be recognized if it ever came again, which is the first act of clinical epidemiology in the Western record. What it was is still argued: typhus, typhoid, some form of fever now vanished. Its effect on the city was worse than its death toll, because a plague dissolves the habits that hold a community together, and what followed was a coarser, angrier Athens, quicker to vote for cruelty and slower to regret it. The war ground on. There were years of stalemate and clever small victories, a peace that everybody signed and nobody kept, and then, in 415 before Christ, the assembly made the worst decision in its history. Persuaded by a brilliant, charming, wholly untrustworthy young aristocrat, it voted to send an enormous expedition across the sea to conquer the largest and richest Greek city in the West, on the far side of a large island, a place that had never done Athens any real harm and could not possibly be held. It was a war of choice, launched in a mood of confidence, against a democracy very like their own, at the end of a supply line hundreds of miles long. The fleet sailed out of the harbor on a bright morning with the whole city on the shore to watch, and the ships raced each other out to sea. 2 years later, almost none of it came back. The expedition was destroyed, the ships trapped in the harbor they had come to blockade. The army broken on the retreat inland, the survivors put to work in the quarries. Some, it is said, bought a little better treatment by reciting choruses from the newest Athenian tragedies to their captors, who wanted to hear them, which is the strangest and most Greek detail in the whole affair. Athens, astonishingly, fought on for another 9 years. It built new fleets out of nothing, spent its reserves, melted the gold, and won battles it had no business winning. What finally ended it was money from the East. The empire, watching happily from the sidelines, began funding Spartan fleets, and a state with a bottomless treasury behind it can lose ships all day. In 405 before Christ, the last Athenian fleet was caught on an open beach up by the straits and taken almost without a fight, and the grain route was cut, and the city was starved out over the winter. The terms were the pulling down of the long walls, the surrender of all but a few ships, and the end of the empire. The demolition was begun to the sound of pipe girls playing, and the men doing the work believed they were beginning the freedom of Greece. They were not. Sparta, having liberated everybody, immediately installed its own governors and garrisons and pro-Spartan committees, and discovered that running an empire requires exactly the flexibility that Spartan education had spent 3 centuries breeding out. Within 10 years, the cities that had cheered were in revolt, and within 30, the whole structure had come apart. In 371 before Christ, on a plain in central Greece, an army from the city of Thebes did something no one had done. Its commander massed his best troops 50 ranks deep on the left, against the Spartan right where the king stood, instead of spreading his line evenly, and refused his weaker wing so that it never engaged. The Spartan line broke. The myth of invincibility broke with it, and it had lasted for 300 years and was gone in an afternoon. Then the Thebans marched south into the valley nobody had entered in arms for centuries, and did the thing that actually finished Sparta. They freed the Helots and rebuilt their old capital as an independent city with walls, and gave 200,000 people their valley back. Sparta lost half its farmland at a stroke, and with it the whole basis of the system, and it never recovered, and its citizen body dwindled to about 1,000 men, and it slid gently into being a curiosity that tourists visited to watch the old customs performed. Theban supremacy lasted less than a decade and ended when its architect was killed in a victory. And Greece entered the middle of the 4th century before Christ exhausted, its cities full of men who had lost their land in the wars and now sold their military skill abroad for wages, 10,000 of them at one point taking employment in a dynastic quarrel in the middle of the empire, and then, when it went wrong, marching home across 1,000 miles of hostile country under commanders they elected themselves. Their leader wrote the story down, and the moment when they came over a ridge and saw the sea and began shouting the word for it down the column to the men behind is one of those passages that survives everything. Everyone in Greece could see that the old system had failed. Speakers made careers out of urging the cities to unite, and the cities went on quarreling. Because a Greek city could no more give up its independence than a man can give up his own name. And so nobody paid enough attention to the half-civilized kingdom in the north, where a new king had just taken the throne of a country the Southerners regarded as a joke. Macedon lay north of the mountains, a wide, fertile plain running up into high forested country, rich in timber and horses and silver and rain, with a population of tough hill farmers and a quarrelsome nobility who hunted, drank hard, and killed their kings with some regularity. The Southerners were not sure the Macedonians were Greek at all. The Macedonians were quite sure they were, spoke a form of Greek, worshipped the same gods, and had for a century been importing Southern poets and painters to make the court look respectable. In 359 before Christ, the throne came to a young man who had spent 3 years as a hostage in Thebes, where he had watched the best army in Greece at close range and thought carefully about it. He was about 23. Within a few years, he had rebuilt the Macedonian army from nothing into a machine, and he did it by combining things other people already had. He took the hill farmers and drilled them year-round as full-time professional soldiers, which no Greek city could afford, and armed them with a pike some 18 feet long held in both hands, so that the points of the first 5 ranks all projected beyond the front of the formation, and the thing became a moving hedge. He kept the noble horsemen and made them the striking arm, a wedge that went in wherever the pikes had prized a gap. He added engineers with torsion catapults, so that for the first time a Greek army could take a walled city instead of sitting outside it. And he used the silver mines he had seized to hire, bribe, and buy his way through problems. Remarking that no wall was too high if a donkey loaded with silver could get over it, he lost an eye to an arrow at a siege and went on campaigning. Over 20 years he absorbed the north, then moved south, using the endless quarrels of the cities as his doorway, since somebody was always inviting him in to settle something. Athens had one great orator who saw exactly what was happening and spent a decade shouting about it, in speeches so effective that his name became the standard for political warning, and he could not get the cities to act together in time. In 338 before Christ, at a town in central Greece, the combined army of Athens and Thebes met the Macedonians and lost. The king's 18-year-old son commanded the cavalry on the left that day and broke the Theban line. Afterwards, the king summoned representatives of all the Greek states, formed them into a league with himself as commander, guaranteed that no city would attack another, and announced a war of revenge against the empire in the east. 2 years later, he was killed at his daughter's wedding by one of his own bodyguards, in the theater in front of everybody, for reasons nobody has ever satisfactorily explained. His son was 20. What the son did in the next 12 years is difficult to describe without sounding like a legend, so it is worth keeping it dry. He put down the inevitable revolts, crossed into Asia in 334 before Christ with about 40,000 men and enough money for perhaps a month, and never came back. He won his first battle at a river crossing in the northwest of Asia Minor, where the Macedonian cavalry rode straight up a muddy bank into the waiting line, which by any sober assessment should not have worked. He then spent a year taking the coastal cities one by one, which was not glamorous, but was the correct move, since it denied the imperial fleet every harbor it had and thus won the naval war on land. He met the great king himself at a narrow coastal plain in the northeast corner of the Mediterranean and broke his line by riding at the king's own position, and the king left the field. He took the island fortress of Tyre by building a causeway out to it through the sea, which took 7 months and which is still there. So that an island is now a peninsula and has been for 23 centuries. He went down into Egypt, which opened its gates, and founded a city on a strip of land between the sea and a lake, laying out the street grid himself, and it became the greatest city of the Greek world within a generation. Then east, across the rivers, to a wide, dusty plain that had been cleared and leveled by the enemy for the use of scythed chariots, where he faced a far larger army and won by pulling its left wing out of position and driving a wedge through the gap. The empire that had ruled from the Nile to the Indus fell to him in 3 battles. He entered Babylon and the ancient capitals and the ceremonial capital in the highlands, where an enormous quantity of treasure had been sitting idle for 200 years, and the burning of that palace, whether by drunken accident or as deliberate revenge for a temple, burned a century and a half before. Closed the account the Greeks had been keeping since the invasion. Then, instead of going home, he kept going. 3 more years through the mountains and deserts of Central Asia, marrying a local nobleman's daughter, adopting elements of Eastern court dress and ceremony, which delighted his new subjects and infuriated his Macedonian veterans, who had signed up to follow a king, not to bow to one. Over the mountains into the Punjab, where he fought his hardest battle against an Indian king with 200 elephants in the rain at a river crossing, and won, and then, by the tradition, asked the defeated king how he wished to be treated, and was told, like a king, and restored him to his throne. And then, at the next river east, in the monsoon, after 8 years and 11,000 miles. The army stopped. They did not mutiny exactly. They simply stood in the rain and would not go on, and after 3 days of arguments and sulking in his tent, he gave way and turned south, and took the fleet down the river to the ocean, and marched a good part of the army home through a desert that nearly finished them. He died in Babylon in June of 323 before Christ, of a fever after a long illness, aged 32, having conquered more of the world than anybody before him, and having made no arrangement whatsoever for what came next. Asked, at the end, who should have the empire, he is supposed to have said, the strongest, which, if true, was the single most expensive sentence in ancient history. The strongest turned out to be several people at once, and for the next 40 years his generals fought over the pieces, murdered his family, crowned themselves, and redrew the map until 3 great kingdoms had settled out of the wreckage, one in Egypt, one across Asia, one back home in Macedon. The age that followed is called the Hellenistic Age, and it is the least famous and in some ways the most interesting part of the whole story, because it is when the Greek world stopped being a collection of villages and became a civilization with continents in it. Greek was suddenly the working language from the Adriatic to the Hindu Kush, in a simplified common form that anybody could learn. And for the next several centuries, a merchant from Marseille, an official in Babylon, a doctor in Egypt, and a garrison commander in Afghanistan could all write to each other without an interpreter. Greek cities were founded by the dozen along the trade routes, each with its marketplace and theater and gymnasium and its stubborn insistence on the old customs. So that there are ruins in northern Afghanistan of a city with a Greek theater and a Greek gymnasium, and an inscription of the wise sayings from the oracle at Delphi copied out and set up in the courtyard, 3,000 miles from the mountain they were carved on. In India, a Greek-speaking king had coins struck in 2 languages and appears in a Buddhist text as a serious questioner of monks. In Egypt, statues were carved of Greek queens in the old Egyptian style, and papyrus letters survive from ordinary settlers complaining about their neighbors in perfectly ordinary Greek. And in that new world of big kingdoms, one city outshone everything. The city on the Egyptian coast had 2 harbors, a lighthouse on an island offshore that stood perhaps 400 feet high with a fire at its top and was counted one of the wonders of the world and stood for over 1,000 years until earthquakes took it, and a broad main street you could see the whole length of. Beside the palace quarter, the kings founded an institution called the Museum, meaning a place of the muses, which was a residential research institute where scholars were paid a salary, given meals, exempted from taxes, and asked to do nothing but work. Attached to it was the library, whose ambition was not to be a good collection, but to be all of them, every book in the world, in Greek or translated into it. The method was cheerfully ruthless. Every ship that docked was searched for scrolls, which were copied, with the copy returned to the owner and the original kept. Agents bought whole libraries abroad. The catalog ran to 120 scrolls just to list what was there. Estimates of the collection run from 40,000 to 500,000 scrolls. And no single fire destroyed it. It declined over centuries through funding cuts, expulsions of scholars, civil disorder, and simple neglect, which is a far sadder and far more familiar way for a library to die. What came out of that building and its rival at another kingdom's capital was the first great age of organized science. A librarian there calculated the circumference of the earth using nothing but a well, a stick, a shadow, and the distance between 2 towns, and got a figure within a few % of the true one, and also drew the first map with lines of latitude and longitude on it. Another astronomer proposed that the earth goes round the sun 17 centuries early and was not believed. Another catalogued 1,000 stars and, comparing his positions with older records, detected the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, a phenomenon that takes 26,000 years to come round once. A mathematician set out the whole of geometry from 5 assumptions in a book so well made that it was still the standard school text in the 1900s. making it the most successful textbook ever written. And on an island in the west, the greatest of them all worked out how to measure the volume of irregular objects, established the principle of the lever and of floating bodies, calculated the value of the ratio of a circle to its diameter more precisely than anyone would for 1,000 years, and built machines to defend his city that so alarmed the besieging Roman fleet that the sight of a rope over a wall was enough to make them back off. He was killed at the end of that siege by a soldier who did not know who he was, and the Roman general, to his credit, was appalled and had him buried properly with a sphere and a cylinder carved on the stone, because of a proof he was proud of. And then there is the object pulled out of a shipwreck near a small island in 1901, a corroded lump of bronze that sat in a museum drawer until somebody noticed gear teeth in it. Modern imaging has now counted at least 30 interlocking bronze gears cut by hand, including a pin and slot arrangement that models the varying speed of the moon around the sky. It is a mechanical calculator of the heavens made about 2,100 years ago, and nothing of comparable complexity is known again anywhere for well over 1,000 years. Somebody built that in a workshop with files. Meanwhile, the kingdoms wore each other down, and the city in the west grew. Rome came into Greek affairs the way everyone came into Greek affairs, invited by one side of a quarrel and stayed. Macedon was beaten in a series of wars, and in 146 before Christ, after a final feudal revolt, a Roman army destroyed the ancient and wealthy city that guarded the isthmus, sold its people, and shipped its art to Italy. Greece became a Roman province. Egypt held on longest under its Greek dynasty until its last queen. The seventh of her name backed the losing side in a Roman civil war, and the kingdom passed to Rome in 30 before Christ. That is usually given as the end of the ancient Greek world, and it is not really an end at all. It is a change of management. The Romans conquered Greece and were promptly conquered by it, as one of their own poets said, with a certain amount of exasperation. Educated Romans learned Greek as a matter of course, hired Greek tutors for their sons, sent those sons to study philosophy at Athens or rhetoric on the Asian coast, copied Greek statues by the thousand, wrote their own epic in imitation of the Greek one, and took the Greek gods wholesale, changing only the names. Athens became a university town, a place of endless students and lectures and ivy, and stayed one for 600 years. Greek remained the language of the eastern half of the Roman world, and when the western half collapsed, the eastern half carried on for another 1,000 years, calling itself Roman and speaking Greek, and in its monasteries and its palace scriptoria monks and scholars copied the old books by hand, generation after generation, from crumbling scrolls onto parchment in a new compact script. And it is because of those copyists that anything survives at all, not the originals. There is no original of anything. Every Greek text we have came through a chain of hands, and the chain was thin. Of the 90 or so plays one tragedian wrote, 7 came through. There are authors whose entire life's work is a single quotation in somebody else's book. Whole libraries of philosophy and mathematics and history are known to us only as titles in a list. Then, from the 14th century onward, Greek manuscripts began arriving in Italy, carried west by scholars, and Western Europe read the originals for the first time in 800 years, and the effect was an explosion that is still called a rebirth. Later, some of it came back another way, through Arabic, because scholars in Baghdad and Cordoba had translated the Greek scientific works centuries earlier and improved on them, and Europe re-imported its own inheritance with interest. And later still, people started digging. A wealthy amateur found the gold masks and telegraphed his excitement to the world. An archaeologist bought a hillside on Crete and uncovered the painted palace and restored it in concrete rather more confidently than anyone would today. A young man deciphered the palace script in his spare evenings and proved it was Greek, then died in a car accident 4 years later at 34. And every year still, a farmer's plow turns up a wall, a diver finds a bronze arm in the sand. An ancient rubbish tip in Egypt yields another few lines of a lost poem, and somebody who has been waiting their whole career for exactly that reads it by lamplight and finds that a woman on an island wrote about her brother coming home safe 26 centuries ago, and the paper has been in a box the whole time. There is one more thing that survived, and it is easy to walk past because it is not in a museum. The language never stopped. Greek has been spoken and written continuously for about 3,500 years, from the clay tablets in the burned storerooms to a conversation happening in a kitchen in Athens this evening, and that is one of the longest unbroken records of any language on earth. It changed, of course. It lost some sounds and simplified some endings and swallowed loanwords from Latin and Turkish and Italian and now from English, the way every living language does. But a modern speaker can read a 2,000-year-old inscription on a wall and get most of it, and the words for bread and water and mother and house and sea and to write and to know have been carried in ordinary mouths, unbroken from the Bronze Age to the bus stop. There is a particular kind of vertigo in that. A shepherd on a hillside in the north today telling a child that it is going to rain is using a word for rain that was written on a palace tablet before the walls at Mycenae were built. Nothing else in this whole story has that continuity. The temples fell down and were quarried for farmhouses. The bronzes were melted. The libraries burned or rotted or were quietly defunded. The empires became provinces and then names in a book. The gods were left behind and their sanctuaries were built over, and the old festivals became new ones with different names on the same dates in the same fields, which is what usually happens to festivals. Even the alphabet, the greatest export of all, went abroad and became Latin and Cyrillic and dozens of others, and left home barely recognizing its own children. But the language itself simply kept going, handed on the only way anything is really handed on, which is one person saying something out loud to another person who is listening. All the marble in the world is more fragile than that. So what is left when the whole 2,000 years has run through your hands? Stone, mostly, and words, and a set of habits so deep in the way we think that we no longer notice we are using them. The stone is easy to point at. There are the temples, of course, and there are also more Greek columns in the ordinary streets of the world than in Greece itself, on courthouses and banks and libraries and museums and the fronts of small town halls in countries the Greeks never heard of. Because when a builder wants to say that something is serious and public and belongs to everybody, this is still the shape reached for. 2,500 years later, without anyone quite deciding it should be. The words are everywhere too, quietly. Nearly every field that ends in the word for study takes its name from Greek, and so does most of medicine and most of the vocabulary of science, and so do politics, and democracy, and history, and theater, and drama, and comedy, and tragedy, and chorus, and scene, and music. and rhythm and harmony and school, which came from their word for leisure, because the Greeks understood perfectly well that learning is what people do when they are not forced to be doing something else. And the habits are the deepest layer. The idea that the world can be explained by looking at it and reasoning about it rather than by being told. The idea that an argument can be laid out in steps so that anyone following honestly must arrive at the same place. The idea that the community's business should be discussed in public by the people it belongs to, and that laws should be written down where everyone can see them, and that power handed over should be handed back. The idea that a story about people making bad decisions for understandable reasons is worth watching in a crowd of strangers. The idea that a body at rest, weight on one leg, is beautiful. None of these were invented cleanly or held consistently. The people who thought them owned slaves and excluded women and executed the best man among them and burned each other's cities over pride. They were not better than us. They were, if anything, unusually good at writing down both their best thoughts and their worst behavior and leaving the two side by side for us to sort out. And in the end, the story is a very simple shape. It began with a clerk counting jars of oil by lamplight in a painted palace on an island, writing in a script nobody can read. In a world where writing existed only to serve a storeroom. That world burned, and the writing was forgotten, and for 400 years there was almost nothing but villages and songs. And then the songs came back with an alphabet under them, and 1,000 small towns argued their way into a new way of living, and out of that came the marble and the plays and the geometry and the boy in Babylon with the whole of Asia behind him and no plan for Thursday. 2,000 years from one clay lamp to another. And the extraordinary part is not that it happened. The extraordinary part is that it very nearly did not survive, and that what carried it through was not armies and not gold, but people copying words by hand in cold rooms for centuries because they thought the words were worth having. History does not really disappear. It gets buried and walked on and built over, and after a long enough time it stops being a story about somebody else and simply becomes the ground under our feet. The hillside where they voted is still there, worn smooth. The stadium is still there with its stone starting line and the grooves cut for the runner's toes, and you can put your foot in one. The theater is still there, and if you sit at the top on a summer evening when the tour buses have gone, and somebody down on the floor of it speaks quietly, you will hear every word. So let all of that settle now, the way dust settles in a room after the door has closed. Let the ships go on making their slow way from island to island with the mountains always in sight. And the lamps come on one at a time in the small houses along the shore. Let the olive trees stand out on the terraces in the last of the light. The same trees, some of them genuinely the same trees, their trunks gone hollow and knotted with the centuries and still setting fruit. Let the marketplace empty and the last farmer take the long road home over the ridge with an empty basket. And the goats come down off the hill. Let the sea go dark and quiet and keep moving in the dark, the way it always has, the way it did before there was anybody there to name it. And let the little clay lamp burn down in the storeroom, with all its jars around it in the warm dark, and the man with his tablet finishing his count, and the marks going soft in the damp clay, and the light getting smaller and smaller and smaller, until there is nothing there at all but the smell of warm oil, and the whole long, quiet weight of everything that had not happened yet. There is nothing else you need to do tonight, nothing left to follow. If you are still awake, there is another long, quiet story waiting on the screen for you, and it will begin the moment this one ends, and you can let it carry you the rest of the way. If this helped you rest, a like or a subscription helps another sleepless person find their way here, and only do it if you truly mean it. And do leave your city and your local time in the comments so that the next person scrolling at 3 in the morning can see they are in good company. Now let your jaw unclench. Let your hands open. Let your breathing go slow and even and a little deeper than it was a moment ago. The empire is long over. The arguments are all finished. The ships are all in. And every single person who worried about any of it slept soundly in the end. Close your eyes. Good night and sweet dreams.